The first time he said it was an accident. It wasn't worth mentioning. He forgot it immediately. "How long can you sit on my neck?" Husband freaked out. Why did she do it in the first place? I don't know. She wasn't old. She wasn't exactly a hag. Another thing is that he, her spoiled, crazy husband, needed a young one. The concept of young for Tom was clear. If a girl did not marry before 21 years old, then she is too old and something wrong with her. Don't ask me why 21st century medieval attitudes. It happens. And Kelly, 36, is a childless grandmother. It's like Tom's forgotten the time when he thought of his wife as his greatest treasure. Spoiled her, bought her everything she wanted, not even for her, but for him. Dragging her around the country from job to job. And then she became a suitcase without a handle. It happened without either of them noticing. She was 18 when they got married. He was 10 years older. She was pretty, in the style of actresses of the 50s, short stature, delicate face, big eyes. He's the most ordinary. You wouldn't immediately remember what he looked like unless they said his name. It seemed to Kelly that Tom had not just fallen in love with her, but clung to her like a tick. He couldn't let anyone else have her. After walking her home in the evening, he wouldn't dare leave the entrance for another hour or two until he saw the lights go out and the windows darken. Surely he was afraid that before Kelly went to bed, someone else might come in and take her away. There was no question about the seriousness of his intentions. He'd proposed to her within a week of meeting her. Tom cared less about the wedding itself, the restaurant, the guests, the honeymoon. Can we do it with or without him? All he cared about was getting married and taking Kelly with him. In the meantime, Tom had quit his job again and was moving up north. Kelly's father kept silent, only sighed, resigned to his fate. And her mother cried she didn't want her only daughter to go so far away. Kelly herself had no time to think about it. Registry office on a weekday, without any celebration. Some hastily organized home parties, and now the train. A rainy evening, and the carriage slowly begins to sail away from the platform. There in the new place, Tom rented a flat, waiting for the time when they would have their own. No carriages, dormitories, or the like that his new mates were content with. It wasn't so much that he was chasing comfort as he wanted to keep Kelly away from any encounters, even casual ones. She was to sit in that 9th floor flat like Rapunzel in the tower, seeing no one but her husband. When Tom was free, they'd go on nature trips. Kelly appreciated the beauty of the north, those pewter, brass, silver colors of the short summer, the still water mesmerizing. The rest of the time she was entertained by books. She'd signed up at the library. And serials, those endless ones where at the beginning of the series the characters start making themselves coffee and then finish the cup at the end. Serials that you could do all your housework to. Tom was a blob of energy, and that's what he took the others by. Charming seemed not at the expense of appearance or intelligence, but because of this vitality, which many lack. In certain cases, if there was no one brighter, he could become the soul of the company. He was always and everywhere regarded by his superiors as indispensable. He really was a jack of all trades. And when he got bored in one place and broke off to go to the other side of the country, it was always regretted by the bosses and those with whom Anatoly worked, and the women with whom he managed to get acquainted and who envied Kelly. "You're not a military man," Kelly said to her husband, "but I feel like an officer's wife always traveling over the road." Tom had always had money. He would never work for an idea. And now, to comfort and cheer up his wife, he floods her with presents. In the wardrobe, racks of dresses, blouses, and suits hung as tightly as if they were in a shop. Kelly could match the outfits with shoes of the right color. And the saying, "a well-to-do woman is one who doesn't wear ripped tights under her trousers," certainly applied to Kelly. He wouldn't let her work. It was out of the question. "We've got enough money," Tom said. "Nothing to go where you can find adventures on your tail." And he didn't want kids for a long time, maybe 10 years. Whether it was the settled, beautiful home life with quiet evenings, cleanliness and freedom to dispose of his time that was more precious to him, or whether he was subconsciously afraid that he would be jealous of Kelly, even of a child. When they finally settled down in a large regional city, their own flat was bought. Tom became a small boss. It turned out that Kelly could not get pregnant and give birth in any way. But this was not the main reason why her husband's attitude to her changed. She simply remained as she was, pretty, but no longer young. But young, quiet, not entering into arguments, and so predictable. He'd had enough of the bland. What did he want? "You're sitting on my neck." Kelly threw her head back. Her, That phrase clawed at her heart. Those words, casually dropped, are always the most sincere. Tom didn't pursue the subject. He was still putting together the wardrobe she'd bought, but his face was absent. In his thoughts, he lived somewhere else. It wasn't long before she realized he had another. He had a crush on a girl the same age Kelly had been when they met. The age difference seemed so vast to Kelly that a connection couldn't be in her mind. It would look both ridiculous and laughable. Naive Daisy. Tom's passion was named Jane, and she was the complete opposite of his wife. An athletic girl with long, strong runner's legs and hair dyed bright pink. And she had so many things, like intricate patterns on her long, sharp toenails, piercings in every possible place, intricate tattoos, that Jane could be looked at for a long time, like a painting or a puzzle. However, Jane didn't make men puzzle for long. She gave up quickly, if the price was right. All this Kelly had learnt in roundabout ways. The big city wasn't really that big. There was only one thing that bothered Tom, but it was the most important thing for her. Jane was not averse to making money wherever she had a chance. The concept of fidelity did not fit in the head of the pink Malvina. She was flying. You want to let her go and keep her at the same time. To let her go, so as not to suffer and not to be tormented by jealousy, to keep her, because without her, no way. Without Malvina, life seemed long, empty and boring, like a gray canvas that stretches to the horizon. His wife became annoying, because she was that very cloth smooth, predictable, without a single bump. You could walk on it with your eyes closed and never stumble. Tom was tired even of Kelly's cuteness, which was beginning to show. If there was a reason to fight, a thunderstorm broke out. A consonant word for a tiff, they'd break everything that could be broken, from dishes to relationships. Maybe he'd feel better. But Kelly didn't go for the provocation. She stood over the cooker, slow-cooking borscht sacred. The smell of meat, garlic, parsley, and satiety. If satiety can have an odor. Even if you swear you eat such borscht and you feel happy. Tom overcame himself and decided to hurry things up. He had a wide circle of acquaintances, including a pimp. No, not the film boy who arrives in a nice car to herd girls on the red light street. Michael was a subtle personality. Either a pimp or a procurer. He could order a girl, a boy, a waistcoat to cry into all night. Michael was also a pro. He could unmistakably determine who was worth what, and who to offer whom. Sometimes he did things that were completely unexpected, but he was never wrong. He knew that this young blonde, with the appearance of a model, can get sick of his partner in an evening. But that woman over there, which seems to be nothing special, will be carried in his arms for a long time. Tom saw Michael several times a year in companies of a certain kind, and always by chance. The next meeting was just as casual, but suddenly Tom had a thought that struck him as brilliant. Maybe he'd just had too much to drink. "Listen, can't you put my wife on the case?" he said. Michael had seen a lot of things in his life, perhaps too much, but here he was dumbfounded. Yes, among his clientele were married women who sometimes wanted a thrill and who would not mind going left. Almost all of them wanted their cheating to remain a secret, except for one totally promiscuous couple who were looking for another equally promiscuous couple. Michael tried to advise the casual acquaintance to go wake up, but the same life experience told him that it would be a good idea to look at this spouse with his own eyes. You never know. They made an appointment. Tom didn't tell Kelly who Michael was. Maybe she wouldn't be right for him, and then they'd have to say goodbye to the tempting idea. He couldn't just leave Kelly at the railway station on a corner somewhere to find her own clients. It would be easier to just kick her out. Divorce her. Michael came to visit, as if he were just an acquaintance. Kelly served the men coffee. She baked a pie with apples and set the table, moving, as always, silently and without uttering unnecessary words. She tried not to interfere with the conversation, present but not involved and not noticing that Michael was watching her. Tom also cast glances at his wife, but not satisfied. Kelly had not dressed up as he had asked. She remained in a simple homemade dress, blue with a ruffle, her hair gathered in a ponytail. She was an actress. Now she was a Ryazan woman. Who needs such a woman? Every man's got one of those. Michael didn't stay long. Tom went out to escort him up the stairs. He was sure that Michael would reject the goods, but he said vaguely, "We'll see." And that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, he called out of the blue and asked Tom for Kelly's phone number. "What do you want?" Tom became wary. Michael was silent for a few moments. "I don't understand what this shifty man wants in the end. To compete with him, to sell his wife himself, flag in hand and a steamroller to go with it. But Michael indeed had an extraordinary case. So he clarified. I think your Kelly would be good for one person, for a conversation. What do you mean, a conversation? He has circumstances. I won't go into details, none of your business, sorry, but this man will be at the restaurant late tonight. He'll be drinking a lot, and he'll probably want someone to be there for him. You listen to what he says, or just keep silent with him. I answer with my head, no one will hurt your wife. Huh? Tom's got it. Then Kelly's fine. You know, when it comes to keeping quiet, she's the best. So give me her phone number, dummy. Because you and I are getting a film, the groom agrees, the relatives agree, and the bride has to be persuaded. In relations with women, if it was necessary, Michael knew how not to press, but to achieve his goal by persuasion found the way to the heart. Tom hesitated a moment, and the phone dictated. Later he would discuss these piquant details with Malvina, and she would complain that there would be no one to take pictures of the secret meeting. If there was dirt on anyone, she would be even more submissive. When he got the number he was looking for, the pimp called immediately. Kelly, he said. Do you remember me? It's Michael, I was visiting you. I have a huge favor to ask of you, don't take it for granted. The woman didn't answer, but Michael realized she wasn't speaking because she was confused. Come to this restaurant tonight. I'll introduce you to a man who cannot be left alone. Believe me, it's very important. You'll save your soul. You should see a psychiatrist, Kelly said and hung up. Then she went about her usual business, and somewhere in the back of her mind, like a spring that had suddenly broken through, she was filled with the thought that it was not for nothing, that it was Tom who had thought up and organized everything. Both Michael and the meeting to which she had now been called. It made her want to cry. Kelly suddenly realized that she hadn't cried for a long, long time. Maybe she hadn't even learned how. You could shed tears if you felt sorry for yourself, but she was too tired to comfort herself. Tom didn't want to look ahead to see a routine life, an impending old age. Kelly was afraid to look back. She could see herself standing there in that kerchief, with the dust rag. The years were behind her when she'd gone from princess to Cinderella, and the prince had degenerated and wouldn't divorce her. Kelly felt like getting drunk. She called Michael back. Okay, I'll go, she said. It was a hotel restaurant, fancy and so expensive that Kelly was embarrassed to even walk past it. The carpeting there was already outside, and there were vases of orchids at the entrance. Kelly hadn't bought clothes in a long time. She'd stayed in that other life, with her husband blowing dust off her. And now Kelly didn't know what to wear. If all she had to do was talk, this dark blue jacket would do. She could match it with the pale blue silk dress she had once loved so much. The silk was real, delicate, not weighty. But there was hardly any cosmetics at home, and perfume only Grasshopper Bridge, with its heavy, clingy odor. Kelly was ready for Michael to send her back, to call some young girl for his client. She was even more embarrassed that she had come first. She walked around the entrance for a while, hesitant to stop lest she be chased away. There must be someone like a doorman. He'd be out in a minute. Why are you standing here? You can't linger here. A black car pulled up. Very inconspicuous, Michael the pimp didn't like too much attention. He got out with the businesslike look of a man who comes to this hotel almost every day. He recognized Kelly immediately. He nodded, didn't say anything about her appearance, but as if he was grateful that she had agreed to this venture at all, and was standing here in person, not late. He took her politely under the elbow, and they went inside. The restaurant was in a semi-basement. Kelly was far from all that. She was much more comfortable with unsophisticated dumplings and pie shops. She would have felt out of place, even if she'd just come here with friends. Now she was tense, looking around, even though she didn't know who was waiting for her. Michael knew. The dim lights, the heavy wooden tables, the bar. For some reason it all reminded Kelly of an old sailing ship, a caravel being carried along by the waves of life. Michael took Kelly to the corner farthest from the entrance, the one with the least light. Here sat the man they needed, or who needed them. A dark-haired, middle-aged man with a thin, nervous face. Kelly noticed there was a hat lying next to him. Who wore hats nowadays? The glass of wine was almost finished. Miss Kelly introduced Michael's companion, and Kelly threw him a surprised look. How did he know her middle name? She'll sit with you as long as you want. Michael understood, but he didn't answer her question. He'll give the name himself if he wants to. Well, I'll leave you to it. The man nodded carelessly. He was immersed in his own thoughts. Another similar nod to Kelly for her to sit down. She sat down with a straight back. There were hardly any customers in the restaurant. Only at one other table, a group of men engrossed in conversation. A young bartender behind the counter, in a white shirt and black waistcoat, and a waitress who approached them almost immediately. A dyed blonde in her mid-40s. She had a tired look. Order whatever you want. The man said to Kelly, nodding at the menu. What food could she think of right now? She was feverish with excitement. A glance at her was enough to realize that. Bring us some for now. Kelly didn't know what the mysterious-sounding words meant, but she guessed they meant wine or something stronger, and an appetizer of some kind. There was silence in the air as they waited for the waitress. What should I call you anyway? Kelly asked. And after a while, are you sick? He was definitely awake. There was confusion in his voice. What makes you think that? She shrugged her shoulders. Nothing else occurred to me. Only that you have learnt that you are ill with some terrible, hopeless disease and have no one to talk to. And I'm now a traveling companion who won't see you tomorrow, so it's okay. You will indeed, one of these days, hear of my death, he said tiredly and calmly, as if it were a done deal. But it is of no consequence. He took her hand, but there was nothing sensual in the movement, nothing of the kind. He held her wrist. Here you are, you need to check your heart. Remind me when you leave. I'll text you the number and you call. You're a doctor. She suddenly remembered him. Yes, he was a doctor, a very famous one. The kind of doctor they always say was from God, from God. She remembered his name, James, but his middle name was lost somewhere. Then I realized. What do you want to put your hands on yourself? Others will do it for me. But how? Are you being threatened? She didn't understand. Maybe some crazy patients he didn't cure. You can't save everyone. But if you know, why don't you leave? Why don't you run away from them? They'll get you everywhere. There's nothing you can do about it. But I can still live today. There was a momentary flash of rage in his voice. Exactly. He tried to argue with fate for a moment. The waitress brought the wine. James signaled for her to leave. She came back with another tray, set out the plates of appetizers, and finally left them alone. What do they want with you? Kelly asked. What for anyway? He was silent for a moment, then said, as if he hadn't heard her, as if he were talking to himself. I've had quite a lot of time, after all. Life could have been shorter and much more precious, so there's not much to repent or regret. But behind it all was a little boy who was desperately scared. And Kelly realized that. She touched his hand too, but not in the way he had done before. She just covered his hand with hers, letting him know that she felt his fear, and she felt sorry for him. Do you have anyone? Kelly asked, and anticipating that he wouldn't understand her question or would misunderstand it, she clarified, my mom, my sister, someone in the family. Can't you go to them? He shook his head. I have relatives, but they are far away in Siberia. We haven't been in touch for a long time. It's just that life has separated us. But I wouldn't go to them anyway. You can't set them up. She took a few sips of this insanely expensive wine, which didn't seem to taste like anything special, but it made her head swim gently. And despite the oddly tragic note of the conversation, a sense of flight and recklessness came. It's a good thing you have someone at all, she said. I miss it all so much now, my childhood, my grandmother, whom I would hug now, her old house. It's a former merchant's house. It had such thick walls, such wide windowsills, and many, many geraniums. I even remember the feeling of it sitting on the windowsill, knees tucked up, a ray of sunlight falling on your face so that you squeeze your eyes shut, and the smell of geraniums. Everything was so safe and solid then, and it seemed like it would always be that way. Kelly noticed that the memories of his childhood seemed to bring him out of his stupor from the world where he was now. James was distracted, herself, in her most difficult, infinitely difficult moments. It had been a lifesaver. Thinking back to the distant years was like diving to great depths. Everything appears a little unreal, a little blurred. It makes my ears pop, but the rest of what I want to think about ceases to exist. So they sat there, reminiscing about their childhood, each of them his own. It didn't matter how interesting and coherent the story turned out to be. What mattered was that you wrap yourself in that memory like a warm blanket. James was talking about a stream that ran through the park in their town, which went into a mysterious black pipe to make films, that's all, and then flowed into a pond, where in summer the boys caught small fish, the size of a little finger, and in winter they skated. And you could clear the snow with a mitten, look through the ice, as if into an aquarium at the algae, at the green beads of cassava, at the still frog, which also looked at you eye to eye. "Come on, I'll walk you back to your room," Kelly said at last. The hour was such that it was time for the restaurant to close as well. She could sense from herself that it would be hard for her to stand on her feet. And how would he feel? He'd started drinking before she got there. But if they leaned on each other, they'd make it. He remembered his number was 211. But when they stopped in front of the door, he gave the key to Kelly, not sure he could get into the keyhole. There were mirrors and orchids in here too. Orchid pots were everywhere in this hotel, and there was glass and metal all around, also shiny, cold, reflecting you 1,333 times. James put his arm around Kelly and stood, swaying slightly. She was precisely the one person he was related to that was so hard for him to tear himself away from. An inexplicable feeling came over her as she pressed herself against his chest. They just stood there, neither moving. And still, just yesterday, Kelly wouldn't have imagined for herself that such a thing was possible. She was reminded of the boy Ben she'd known since she was a little girl. He lived in their backyard. Only she'd been very young then, about 4 or 5 years old, and he was already graduating from high school. A handsome red-haired boy, her first love, which she hid from everyone, even from her mum. Then they saw each other many years later. He became a helicopter pilot, went to Afghanistan, fought in battles, got married. His Mia was a very sick person, a severe diabetic, and everything was repeatedly complicated by her carelessness. She could forget to give an injection on time, and he trembled when he rushed home after work. What would he catch? Would everything be safe there? He didn't look like his old self anymore, heavy, gray-haired. But Kelly had a wonderful feeling every time she found herself in his company. The cliched expression, like being behind a stone wall, was the most accurate. Protection, calmness, confidence in her own safety, and the fact that he would not let anything bad happen would shield her from everything. Of course, they remembered each other, talked about their childhood. And Kelly admitted to no one that she often envied Mia's diabetes. And now James was the second one to come her way. It couldn't be explained in words. He was in some desperate bind from which he saw no hope of getting out, and she was beside him, feeling the peace she'd only had as a child, and she couldn't find the strength to pull away, to say goodbye, to walk away. It was the one moment of her life that if you didn't appreciate, if you didn't give up everything else for it, you'd always regret missing. Kelly closed her eyes and took a short, convulsive breath. In the morning she started to hurriedly pack, but he told her, "Kelly, sit down." His tone was different now, as if the momentary weakness he had allowed himself yesterday had passed. Now he spoke to her as an elder, as one to be obeyed. "What I'm going to tell you now, you must listen calmly." Kelly sat down. She didn't look at James, averting her eyes. This night felt like it had been stolen from her. She didn't feel worthy of this man. What had Tom insinuated to her over the past few years aged, faded, bland, unwanted? There's no such thing as an unattractive woman. There's no such thing as too little vodka. Well, last night's wine had been enough to make her pass for a sensual beauty. But it's daytime, sunshine in her wrinkled, unmade face. "I'll give you some money," James said. And before she could take offense and resent that it was payment for the night, he continued. "You're going to have to change your life very soon. You're going to have to do it. Believe me, I know. If I turn out to be wrong, you can toss that money in the Mississippi, give it to charity. But I'm giving it to you now so that when the time comes you can walk away and start over. Do you understand me?" She didn't realize how much money he was talking about until he opened her purse and dropped in 3 wads of $5,000 banknotes in a banker's girdle. Kelly gasped, "Are you crazy? I'm not taking it for anything." "Luba, I don't need that money anymore," he said, separating each word from the other. "That's what I wanted somewhere in some fund. You can do it for me later." But she was so shocked by what was happening that she let the words pass her ears. "Will you give me your phone number?" she asked as she walked away, resigned to the weight of her purse. Sure, he dictated the number. Have you calmed down? His face didn't flinch. Yes. Will I see you again? He pulled her to him again and stroked her hair for a long time. And now she was sure that even if they never met again, this bond would remain between them forever. The house was empty, Tom at work, the usual mess that reigned whenever her husband stayed home for even a few hours without her. The dirty dishes in the kitchen. Kelly walked slowly through her flat, as if it were someone else's. Would Tom ask her when he returned if she'd had anything with this stranger from the hotel, or just a conversation, as the pimp had promised? And probably her husband had arranged with the lawyer for some sum of money to be received for her. In the evening, Tom asked no questions. He took the lid off the pot and inhaled the smell of chicken soup with a look of bliss on his face. Pouring himself a deep bowl, still steaming, he sat down and began to eat. Kelly walked out of the kitchen. Another day passed, another. James didn't call her, nor did she call him. But Kelly had no doubt he would make himself known. People like that don't lie, don't dodge, don't disappear, don't sneak out of other people's lives in haste like thieves. On Saturday, before having coffee, Tom went down to the ground floor and picked up the mail. Yes, they still subscribed to a few newspapers, and, for Kelly, an indoor plant magazine in archaism, but there it was. Kelly herself didn't know why she picked up the local paper, unfolded it, and saw his portrait. A famous doctor. Tragic death. Burnt body found in the woods. All his regalia was listed: born, graduated from the institute, worked, taught. The funeral will be today. They say fainting can be avoided. Kelly remembered something like that. It is only in films and books heroines beautifully and smoothly sink to the floor, and the heroes rush to bring their feelings. Kelly's friend had fainted once. In a very unfortunate way, she had fallen and knocked out her front teeth. Kelly herself was now dizzy, and a black veil was thickening in front of her eyes. She fumbled for a trestle, sat down, and just breathed deeply for a while, concentrating on that. When she felt better and realized she could stand up, Kelly said to her husband, "I need to go to the funeral." She couldn't see his face, but she could clearly picture the way he raised his eyebrows. "Whose are these? Do you know him?" She couldn't remember if she had a black dress. What did it matter, though? James was being buried from that farewell hall in the medical center. Kelly had never seen so many people come before, and she never would again. The small hall couldn't hold everyone, and people were standing outside. Someone tried to go inside, but a young woman wearing a mourning bandage on her head came out. She was tall, not grief in her eyes, but defiance, a desire to stand up for herself. "Wait here. There's no room for relatives there, it's stuffy. What do you care? The coffin is closed anyway." Someone whispered that it was Alicia, the seventh water on the Sour Patch, the sister-in-law of a cousin, and sighed disapprovingly. Why hurt people? It's a common grief, and indeed crying without hiding. Very young girls crying old people. These were James's former patients. Those whom he saved, pulled out, came out. A unique, absolutely unique doctor. There would be no more like him. He could see right through a person, look at them, touch them, and realize what had happened to you. And they'll never find the people who killed him. That's how it always happens. If such a unique person is taken away from us, no one will be responsible. When the crowd began to move, and they carried wreaths and heavy lacquered coffin, when they started to get into buses, there were not enough standing places. And there was a cavalcade of cars and young guys on motorbikes, bikers. They were patients, too. Kelly didn't even try to join anyone, to ask to get into a car, to squeeze onto a bus, to stand on the steps. She leaned against a birch tree and cried, covering her face with her hands. She cried even after everyone had left. It was somehow unnoticeable. Kelly spoke to Tom now as if he were a stranger. Everyone lived their own lives, and in the evenings Kelly sat in the rocking chair by the window for a long time. She had her knitting on her lap, but she did not touch the needles and was deep in thought. About 3 weeks later, Tom said to her, "I found you another client." Kelly didn't immediately realize what he was saying. She looked at her husband exactly as he said the phrase in a language she didn't know. "Well, they gave me such good money for you that time," he explained. "Now Michael is offering more." Yeah, Kelly said automatically. James knew everything in advance. "You'll see I'm right." Kelly found nothing better than to hide the money he gave her inside the piano. There they waited for their time, and it had come. Now it had to be decided where to go. Pack her things and disappear from the house right after her husband left for work, so he'd keep her out of her hair longer. No, of course she'd leave him a note, explain that he didn't need to look for her. Maybe he'd even be glad, and a pink Malvina would take up residence in their flat tomorrow. Kelly didn't care about that. She knew she wouldn't go to her parents' house, because there, if her husband wanted to look for her, he'd find her immediately. And she needed to get away from everyone and start, as James had told her to do, with a clean slate. She was sure he could see everything that was going on from there, knew she was pregnant too. It was a gamble, of course, and with the money that had fallen on her from the sky, or rather had been shoved into her bag, Kelly had bought a modest house in the countryside rather than a luxurious city flat, which would have sufficed for her. She put the rest of the money into an account. She wanted silence, the silence from Voznesensky's poems. I want silence, silence. Are my nerves burned? Silence. So that the shadow of the pine tree, tickling us, shifting, chilling us like a prank, along our backs to the little toes of our feet, of silence. The man who had sold her house was overjoyed. Some years ago he had built this little house for his old mother, to replace the wooden hut that had promised her. One room, a kitchen and facilities in a small cubbyhole at the end of the corridor. What else do you need to live? But the mother had already turned 95, and even in this house box she could no longer live alone. Her son took her to his house. The house, painted for some reason in the color of sea waves, remained an orphan, for country roads for country dwellers cramped, but Kelly just right. She arrived with only one bag, and at first she was afraid if someone came to the wicket, looking out from behind the curtain, trying to see who needed it. But Tom didn't look for her. He rang once. Kelly's heart snapped when she saw who the call was from, but all he asked was, "You're not coming back?" "No." "Are you paunchy or something?" He guessed. "Not your concern. And the baby's not yours." "Indeed, it's not mine, at least begging with this child, if you're so stupid." "What's it to me?" "That's what I called to say I've changed the locks in the flat, so I can't come and take out whatever you want. And Jane's home most of the day." Anyone else would have wished Jane would choke on other people's stuff. But Kelly was too quiet. All she said was, "We've been together so many years, and you don't know me that well." She was settling into the village. Any walk turned into a long journey. You have to go to the shop, put an hour on it. To the pharmacy, to the post office that's even further. Only the church was close. Almost across the road you could see the domes through the window. The church, by some whim of fate, was the same color as her hut. But it was not a second home for Kelly. The priest was too peculiar. Father Valentine had nothing in common with that legendary Valentine of love. Soon Kelly began to suspect that the priest had been exiled to such a remote village for his brashness. He considered himself to be the first authority for everyone. He criticized even his own superiors, going as far as the patriarch and parishioners, at whom he was angry. Could get a nettle on the forehead from the expansive priest. The women who worked in the temple hoped that it was a youthful thing, that it would all pass. The only sin that the priest could admit to with a stiffened heart was that he was a complete stranger to Nestiazatism. His house was the best in the village, and there was room for another church. Still, Kelly came to the services at least once in a while, stood at the door, and as soon as she felt stuffy, hurried out into the fresh air. Luckily for her, the family had a hospital, not a hospital, but a small, cool, almost empty old hospital, where Kelly was monitored so that she didn't have to travel far in a crowded bus to the district center. Gradually, Kelly was drawn into her new existence. She planted her own herbs in the vegetable garden, remembered the names of the local shop assistants. She was already left her favorite buns in Rozhenka when the goods were finished. People on the street greeted her. And yet she was afraid of the nights. In the city, the night is conventional, except that at 2 or 3 o'clock the streets quiet down for a while. The village, on the other hand, was sinking into darkness like the sea. Rare lanterns and lights not in all the houses. The darkness seemed to swamp everything around it. The glowing windows somewhere made one think of a ship standing in the distance, on the roadstead. Anything could happen at night. Kelly was afraid that her labor would start at night too, and the ambulance wouldn't arrive in time. So she agreed to go to the hospital a few days before her due date, and was glad she hadn't had time to get a cat like she wanted. Who would she leave her with now? There was nothing left for her but to rely entirely on fate. Would she live? Would the baby be all right? Would she have the strength to look after it? All this now depended not on her, but on some higher power. But everything had gone remarkably well. She even managed somehow to brace herself internally, and not to scream. And the boy that Anne the midwife had shown her had been very good too, though his face was red and puffy. "But look at his eyes, they're silver," said Anne. "I've never seen anything like them. Really." Kelly knew she wouldn't name the baby James. She was superstitious now, catching the signs of fate. The son was not to repeat his father's fate. And a week later, when she returned home, staggering from weakness, she knew what name she would give her son Mark. They had never had such a name in their family before. Let everything begin with a clean slate. Father Valentine insisted that all newborns be baptized in the church. God forbid, not at home, even in the bitter cold. "Boys are brought into the altar," he said. "How can you deprive a child of that?" It was August. It smelled of apples, and at night the stars flew to earth as often as snow in winter. Mark's godparents were neighbors, husband and wife, Chloe and Ethan. When the boy was brought to the temple, he laughed for the first time. He was lying in Ethan's arms and pulling his hands upwards to where the blue haze of the dome was, and he laughed as if he saw someone he knew and was happy about it. "He sees angels," said the woman who cleaned the temple. There was sadness in her voice. Seeing angels is also a challenge, because cleanliness has to be matched. What Mark was seeing, naturally, no one knew about until the boy spoke. No one even understood what was going on. Well, the child laughs and stretches his arms as if someone is standing in front of him, but probably many babies do that. And sometimes, especially at night, when Kelly put him to bed, Mark would cry and wrap himself in the blanket, as if he hoped to escape under it. "What are you afraid of?" Luba coaxed him affectionately. "There's no one in the room, only you and me and the cat sitting over there, washing itself. The cat that they had been given as a present and crossed themselves over. Probably the neighbors didn't know where to give the litter." It was the most ordinary, gray-colored, nasal, big-eyed. Later it seemed to Luba that she had special feelings for the boy. There was a cupboard in the room, left by the previous owner. They had been like this in almost every house before, tall, wooden, with hangers on the right, shelves on the left, and a square of glass in the door, covered with embroidery. On a black background, an old woman had painted roses with a needle and thread. Mark was afraid of the wardrobe at night. During the day he could climb into it and play there, God knows what he imagined, among the hangers of dresses. He could have a house or a spaceship in there, but when it started to get dark, the first place where that darkness descended was the wardrobe ajar. Mark didn't even dare look in there. And if his gaze did fall there by chance, he withdrew it immediately, as if something terrible lurked there and watched him from there, something better not to be seen face to face. Then the cat would leap to Mark and stare into the darkness herself, staring with cold yellow eyes, as if she were on guard and watching. She knew unmistakably when the boy was worried, when he was having nightmares, and she would slip in and lay on his chest, becoming a shield between him and those he feared. Distracted by her song, she purred surprisingly loudly. As Mark began to talk, Kelly asked him, "Honey, what do you see?" "There." He answered expressively, nodding at the cupboard and raising his eyebrows, not understanding how the obvious could not be clear to her, and almost adding, "There it is." Sometimes, to his mother's utter consternation, Mark began to mutter excitedly and quickly, talking either to himself or to someone whom today's psychologists like to call an imaginary friend. In everything else, the boy not only did not differ from his peers for the worse. "How did you come up with that?" he asked, looking at the creepy image he had created. He outperformed them. About 3 years old, learned to read, and by the time he went to school, read many books from the Library of Adventures. He knew a lot of poetry, wrote in jagged block letters, and had the kind of imagination that made the fairy tales so beloved by children pale in comparison. On a warm April evening, Kelly sat with Mark by the river. Even though she was settling in a new place, but still she could call only her son her soulmate. And when she had the chance, she took him by the hand, and they went for a walk somewhere far away, then along the path among the meadows that bloomed so gloriously in summer. Then between the mysterious ferns, the forest was in darkness, and the ferns seemed to glow by themselves with a soft green light to a distant lake or following the bends of the river, where the local boys did not climb. They sat on the cliff, looking at the swift current, at the sand. It was amazing here, almost completely white, silky, and suddenly Mark touched his mother's elbow. "Look, Mum, there's a leshy," he said. Kelly took a look. It was just a huge, human-sized stump with petrified, intertwined roots. Look at it, look at it. It's the woodsman leaning over the river. He is old. He came out of the forest after winter and came to say hello to the mermaid. She is looking at him from the pool, and he extends his hand to her, saying, "Well, have you survived the cold?" Kelly realized it was all imagination. "You'll probably write your own book someday." She kept wanting to hug her son, to hold him. And every time she held back from doing it, she couldn't. She couldn't let Mark become too tender, too vulnerable. He had to live in a cruel world. She knew that well. "No, Mom, and I'd love not to see it, but it's there, you know. We went to the cemetery yesterday," he said, even with irritation. They did go there yesterday, along with an old lady neighbor who had asked him to help clean up a grave. It was already difficult for her to bend over, but she wanted to visit her husband. The old lady walked with her right hand resting on a stick, with Kelly supporting her on her left. "So?" Her mother didn't understand. Mark sighed. "There was also a funeral going on at that time, remember? Well, this auntie, she stood back and watched." "What lady?" Kelly asked. Mark patiently explained. "The one they thought was buried. She stood to the side and watched them. Only she was a little different, not like them, as if she were made of thick fog, a little transparent, wearing a white polka-dot blouse, a pleated skirt, and a scarf." Kelly inwardly gasped. She knew who Mark was talking about, because she had gone to say goodbye to the deceased. She was already part of that circle when everyone from the neighborhood saw the deceased off, when neighbors came to celebrate a wedding or a birth. But she hadn't taken Mark with her to the house yesterday, and the only thing he could see in the cemetery was a staked coffin. Kelly squatted down in front of her son and took him by the shoulders. "I'm begging you," she said. "No, I beg you. Tell me everything you see that others don't see, only me. Only me. Do you understand?" He looked at her earnestly, with his silver eyes, which the further they went, the more they took on a marvelous hue. She was not a hypnotist. She could not suggest anything to him, but he could sense from her tone that the matter was serious. "Do you understand?" She tried to explain to him as an adult. "If you like this, left and right will start to tell everyone about the foresters and ghosts. At first people will think that you're making up everything, that you just think it, and when you grow up a little, you'll be locked up in a madhouse." "Where to?" "Ben." He had this habit of raising his eyebrows. "It's a place where they lock you in a room and don't let you see your mum. There are bars on the windows. You sit on a chain like a dog and they feed you from a dog bowl." In her heart, Kelly asked the higher powers to forgive her for this cruelty, because the worst thing for her was that if Mark was declared insane, they might not put him in an asylum, but they wouldn't be able to avoid notoriety. And if it stuck, alas, forever. Mark nodded. "But if something scares you, if there's something you want to share, we'll talk to you about it," Kelly insinuated, squeezing his hand painfully. "But only to me, only to me, only to me about it. Deal?" Mark kept his word. What he'd really been through, even Kelly didn't know. You can't describe every shadow, every look or call from the beyond. Mark had learned to hold back. The only time he'd nearly blundered was when, in 10th grade, the boys had decided to celebrate Halloween. By this time, his classmates already knew that Mark was the best artist in the school, and he was asked to make up those who came in costumes. One of the worst bullies, Alex Smith, dressed up as a devil, and when he sat down on a chair in front of Mark, he looked up and shuddered. Then he picked up a box of paints, but every time he swung the brush, Mark looked away, as if he were drawing a picture from the original. The makeup was amazing. Alex was scared of himself in the mirror. There he stands. Mark started and stopped, and that autumn he was being drafted into the army. Kelly desperately didn't want to let her son go, but she just didn't know how to avoid it. He'd grown up to be a healthy, good-looking lad, the kind of guy who wouldn't be rejected by the medical board. Unless he had to pay someone a bribe, there was money. But how to do it all? Kelly agonized. She was embarrassed, ashamed, but she felt more sorry for Mark. "No need, Mom. I'll go and come back," said the son. "That's what I'm telling you. Let's go into town while we still have time. You can show me your father's grave." Kelly didn't know where James was buried. but it wasn't hard to find him. Every cemetery has its Rublevka, and this was one, laid out in the bad 90s. It was first inhabited by higher-class gangsters, victims of contract killings and random shootings. Then, they were joined by businessmen from the same gangster circles of higher class, but they stayed here longer. Servants of the people and the heads of the last surviving factories were added here. The monuments were rich black or colored granite 1.5, 2 human heights. Gloomy spruce trees, heavy chains fencing off the slabs of the grounds. The burials were with reserve, with the expectation for the whole family in the future. But sometimes there were decent men here. James had a simple white marble monument. On his gravestone were surgical gloves and a scalpel, as if he'd just come back from an operation and dropped them without looking. Kelly was grateful to fate that the grave had been found, and so quickly that she could show it to her son. She shifted her gaze from the monument to her son, who was taller than she was. Mark stood and stared, his face growing more and more perplexed. And then he said, "There's no one here." "What do you mean?" "The coffin is empty." Kelly searched for an explanation. She already knew her son wasn't wrong. But there was no way he could be right. "But it's been so long. And there was a big fire. It must have been like a crematorium." Mark only shook his head, but he looked at his mother again and said nothing. They walked towards the exit along the cemetery alley, and golden maple leaves swirled above them. Mark served really well. He wrote letters to his mother, which not only had no complaints, but always a joke, always a light mockery, and Kelly smiled as she read them. But he didn't go back. He found a job in town. And what a job. Kelly fought with her son for almost the first time. "Your father's going to curse me from the dead," she said in tears. He was ahead, above everyone else, a real intellectual, a scientist. He probably could not even imagine that his son would not go to the institute. "Where are you going?" "To the dog shelter, washing bowls and cleaning up faces." "Mum." Mark's voice came through the phone as if his son were there. "At least there's no blackness, none at all, even when they're dying." "Well, you know all dogs go to heaven." The shelter was run by volunteers. There were only 1, 2 or 4 regular workers. Emma, who was considered the owner, was an attractive middle-aged blonde. She had a good voice, and from time to time she organized charity concerts in town. She sang to earn the dogs and cats some bread, or rather chicken carcasses, groats and dry food. And then there was Mary, who cleaned the small little dogs that sat in separate cages. The cages stood on top of each other, and the whole thing looked like an open multi-story house. Mary kept order and had some veterinary skills. And finally there was Mark, who did all the heavy lifting. He was paid enough for food in a rented flat, a modest 1-bedroom. However, he was not always able to go there at night. 500 tailed souls lived in the shelter, and it often turned out that some of them could not be left unattended even for a few hours. The shelter was enclosed by a high, blank fence. It was located almost outside the city, in an industrial zone. There was no housing here. Still, many people had strong feelings about the shelter. Some people were disturbed by the very fact of its existence. These people demanded the destruction of all the inhabitants of the shelter, and sometimes even threw poison in pieces of meat over the fence. Others brought in dogs and cats that they could not keep for some reason. Sometimes they solved the issue honestly. They paid a fee. Sometimes they tried to drive up quietly, tied the dog at the gate and left, saying that they would take the poor thing anyway. They wouldn't go anywhere. Just behind the fence there was a hut. It was considered to be Emma's office. But in fact it served as a servant's quarters for everyone. There were refrigerators with dog food and medicines. Here the weakest puppies lived in boxes, and here the shelter duty officer, most often Mark, slept on the sofa. There was also a large structure that looked like a hangar. Small dogs lived in cages here and cats in a separate room. And in the courtyard there were enclosures close together, one to the other, with 2 big dogs in each enclosure. Morning was the time when it was impossible to sit down. Mark cooked food for the animals on the fire. The shelter had poor amenities. Even light and water were constantly cut off because of debts. If possible, water was stored in large bowls, and almost every day rats drowned in them, which could not be eradicated. Feed the animals, clean the cages, give injections to the sick, take someone to the vet. Time flew by. In the afternoon, volunteers, mostly schoolgirls, would arrive and the lucky dogs would go for a walk with them. Hands were in short supply, and someone would get a chance to get out of their cage once every few months. Every dog and every cat had a hard fate behind them. Mark felt sorry for all of them, but he had a special relationship with Gerda, a sheepdog who came to the shelter last year. Later we learned that the owner had culled the dog because its ears did not stand up in due time. So as a teenager, Gerda found herself on the street. She joined a small pack of stray dogs. Together, in the jungle of the big city, it was easier to survive. She fell in love with the pack. Volunteers found the sheepdog in the winter. She hadn't left her mate for 24 hours. He was hit by a car and was still alive, slowly freezing. They took the dog to the clinic and gave the dogs names. He's Kai, she's Gerda. An emergency collection for treatment was announced, but Kai could not be saved. Gerda stayed at the shelter. Sheepdogs in general pick up everything on the fly, and Gerda eventually started to live out of her enclosure. She was so intelligent that she freely walked around the territory at night, guarding it. During the day, she watched out for strangers who came to the shelter, but never once bit anyone. For some reason, she chose Mark out of all of them and stayed near him, and somehow, in between, easily learnt all the commands. And now, when Mark stayed overnight in the shed, he sat on the doorstep, watching the sunset, and Gerda lay at his feet. Maybe some people complained about the stale air around the shelter, too many dogs, no matter how much you cleaned, but Mark breathed easy here. He was used to seeing more than the others, and though he was used to it, he was often uneasy among people. In the shelter, those attentive eyes, hot breathing tongues, the hope to live another day, and the vast sky above his head. There were no high-rise buildings around the sky. Looked at the dogs, and many went there on their last journey because there were enough sick and crippled. Feeding, treating, placing in good hands, all this was hard work, and it occupied both hands and thoughts. This was Mark's place on earth. The car pulled up in the evening. The first to hear it, of course, was Gerda. Seeing the dog's upturned muzzle, Mark listened too. Someone else has been brought in, he thought. Now they'll leave them and go away. If they're helpless puppies or kittens in a box, leave them outside overnight. They might live till morning. The hour was already quite late. Mark was lying on the sofa, watching a film of French comedy as old as this little TV set. As he was putting on his shoes, a car honked. Whoever was there wasn't going to run away quietly like a thief. Gerda, of course, had linked up with him to check the situation and make sure Mark wasn't in any danger. Near the gate, not far from the lilac bushes, you couldn't see them in the darkness, only the sweet smell could be heard, stood a black Jeep, and next to it a woman of small stature, with smoothly slicked back hair, also all in black jacket, jeans. Sometimes Mark sensed something unkind coming from the man, but it wasn't there now. But anxiety was born and grew. "Did you bring someone?" he asked, saying hello. "It would be better to do it this afternoon. There is a contract to be drawn up." "I'm here to see you, Mark," said the woman. Her voice was slightly hoarse, but what surprised Mark most of all was that she knew him by name. He had almost no acquaintances in town, outside the shelter, except for volunteers and veterinarians. "What did you want from me? Can we talk to you?" He caught the insistence in her voice and hesitated to ask her out. "There's a dozen puppies in the shed. Not every untrained person could handle it. To the dogs, they'd raise a fuss." "Let's get in the car," the woman said. She didn't switch on the interior lights, and when Mark sat down next to her, he could see her face in profile, lit only by the light of the moon. Gerda remained lying beside the car. "I wanted to offer you a job," said the woman. He was even more confused. "But I'm not going to leave here." She turned towards him. The darkness now completely hid her face, and only her eyes glittered slightly. "Mark, I'm not going to lure you away from the orphanage with tempting conditions. It's more serious than that. My husband and your father were once friends. I'm the only one who knows whose son you are, and God forbid anyone else should find out." She did manage to stun him. "Listen to what I have to say." She touched his hand, her fingers were icy cold. "Your father's death has remained a mystery to the inquiry, hasn't it? He didn't speak of what he'd discovered in the cemetery. He just nodded. The investigators couldn't find out who was involved in James's death. All ends in water. It's a cult, Mark. It's the kind of force that shouldn't be allowed into our lives." The woman introduced herself. Her name was Isabella, and her husband, also now deceased, was Sam. She and James grew up together, went to medical school together. James was truly one of a kind. Such heightened sensitivity multiplied by knowledge. Disease has 1,000 subtle signs that even doctors don't always pay attention to. There's no way to put them all together. James saw, felt, anticipated. I don't remember him being wrong. 01759, my husband didn't have anywhere near that gift, but sometimes he had dreams. And yes, while your father was a surgeon, my husband was a psychiatrist. And so, the woman was silent, whether to cope with her feelings or to choose her words. At first it seemed that all these people, mostly young people, boys and girls, that they were just looking for extreme sports and had gone a little bit far where it was dangerous. They flocked from all over the world, even from Siberia, I think. I learned that later on by crumbs, by drops. The newcomers signed an agreement in blood, of course, that they renounced any faith and would serve only darkness. They met first at the home of one of these sectarians who lived on the outskirts of the city. Then they found a hut in the woods. Rituals, ceremonies, reading books on black magic. You see, Mark, you can't joke about this. Even with the occult aspects aside, it just makes you go crazy fast. And yes, they had sacrifices. They started with pets. And I won't tell you what they did to them. It'll hurt you to hear it. But eventually they got to humans. Firstly, once you joined the sect, you couldn't leave alive. Secondly, it was believed that if a person with a special gift was sacrificed, everyone who participated in the ritual would become stronger. So they searched for such unusual people. And of course they couldn't miss your father. And yes, he knew about it, knew they had sentenced him. So why didn't he go? How many were there? You mean the police? There's about 100 of them today, as far as I know. When you're dealing with fanatics of an idea, especially an idea like this, it's scary. What police? If you're sentenced, tomorrow on the street a random passerby will just stick a shiv in your side. Believe me, there will be a way. My husband took your father's death very hard. He said that the leaders of this sect were mentally ill, that they needed to be treated. There were cases he discouraged kids from going there, discouraged all those who were lured by this black romance. And he paid the price. He was next. He had a gift, too. James told Sam about your mum, so I've been following her life from afar, and I know who you are. And now my daughter's in danger. I think you're the only one who can protect her. Mark was released with great reluctance. It was only when he left unexpectedly and without any clear reason that it became clear how indispensable he was to the orphanage. Mark assured them he wasn't going for long. But he said it out of thin air, and he wasn't sure of anything. If Isabella was a wealthy woman, as he thought, she could hire a professional guard, or even a bodyguard for her daughter. He himself had no skills under his belt other than the army, where Mark had been trained as a signalman and had been allowed to shoot a machine gun once. What Isabella was hoping for was beyond his comprehension. I'll tell you more about it on the spot, she promised and added as a control shot. Please don't refuse, in memory of my father, in memory of their friendship with my husband. And now they were driving this very black Jeep, and looking through the tinted windows was literally seeing the world in black, as if he were deeply depressed. How did your husband die? Mark asked, because it was going to be a long journey and there was something to talk about. Isabella gripped the steering wheel tighter as the tarmac changed to dirt and the car shook. No big deal to anyone. I went to the dacha in early spring with my daughter, with Mia, and went fishing, and then they found him. He was lying face down in the water. We were told he'd suffocated. There was no water in his lungs. It was his heart. But couldn't that have happened? Lots of people have heart attacks. Why do you suspect someone? It's paranoia, isn't it? I'm too afraid for my daughter. Isabella said melancholically. All these years I've been following this sect as far as I can, even if indirectly, even if by word of mouth, but these guys have what they call their own handwriting. Do you understand? They offered both of them, first James, then Sam, to join them. If your dad wanted to, he could have made a career out of it. Imagine when one of their adepts can see through people, diagnose and heal, how cool that would be for them. After he flat out refused, he was warned since he didn't want to be a follower, he would become a victim. And then there was that final warning when he realized that it was serious, and that he was essentially condemned. That's when he met your mother. It's kind of a miracle that you were born, you know? And Sam was ruined by his tongue. He was mocking and openly trying to fight against them. I warned him against it. It was no use. When he left for a while, I thought it was a coincidence too, a tragic accident. Of course, these guys wouldn't stop. Sacrifice is a regular ritual. And all those people, victims of fires that happened somewhere in the woods or in old abandoned houses, it's their work. But the other day, traditionally, with the onset of the warm season, the family would move to the cottage. This continued even after Sam's death. Lydia has her own firm. She is an interior designer and often went to the customers in the morning, and Mia was left alone. The garden community is small. It's quiet, grassy streets are deserted for part of the day. All the neighbors know each other, and a new person is immediately in sight. But Mia, lying in a hammock in the garden, was not alert when she saw a stubby boy, about her own age. He asked for a drink, and she let him draw water from their well. Even in the heat of the day, the water was cold and clear as a tear. "Don't you miss your father?" he asked, suddenly winking at her. "Don't be sad. You'll meet him soon." Isabella kept her daughter safe. She didn't tell her anything scary, anything that might frighten or upset her. That's why Mia didn't pay much attention to the conversation, but she passed it on to her mother. A strange man came in, and Isabella was terribly worried. They're going round and round, you see. They've got some kind of diabolical circle. The murders happen in the same places at roughly equal intervals. When these people target someone, they act with the tenacity of fanatics. They have to get what they want at all costs, you know. At any cost. There's no logic to it. Isabella slowed down and turned to Mark. Her voice sounded almost pleading. "Do you see why I came to you? Everywhere I go now, I get laughed at. Some boy asked for water and said something. But my husband's death has nothing to do with criminality in the eyes of everyone. What do you think of it? If there's no sign of violence." Sam was startled by something, startled to such a degree, so horrified that his heart stopped. That look on his face, then his features smoothed out. But I remember I saw him shortly after, and that's when it all started again. It was your mum, Mark, who told me about the gift you inherited from your father. Only it's gone further with you, you see more. Only you can sense trouble coming. I'm not asking you to get involved, God forbid. I'm not asking you to go into battle for my Mia, but to warn you, just to warn you, to hide her somewhere in time. They won't be after you. They know nothing about you, though you would no doubt be a very valuable asset to them. If you fall into their clutches, it's like falling into the clutches of a spider. You can't get out. They drug the victim, then scotch them. No one hears anything, and they don't find the victim right away. I only know you won't believe it, because thanks to your gift, what others can only laugh at is unquestionable to you. Gerda lay at Mark's feet, shifting her gaze from Isabella to her master and breathing hotly, sticking out her tongue. It was indeed a fertile corner. Isabella, with a special key, opened the gates of the garden community, and they seemed to enter a completely different world, where silence, emerald grass, birdsong, and negativity. On this day there were no dacha dwellers. Only one woman was digging up the soil on her plot, and a man was lying on the veranda on an old sofa, and his peace was rested by a dog, but good-natured, it did not even bark at the car. Isabella's cottage struck Mark. It was something between a rustic cottage in the mountains somewhere in Europe and a medieval castle. A real tower of rough stone beckoned to the eye. "Wow," he said involuntarily. Isabella glanced round, grinned. "I like this place. There's a lake nearby, you'll see. But when I bought the land, it was all overgrown with wild grapes, and there was a half-collapsed hut hiding in it. Why a tower? I'm an extreme designer, and I've loved Bradbury since I was a kid. At the end of every spring, I bought dandelion wine, and by autumn, I'd read the book to death. I just breathed it. I learned to see the miracles in everything around me. Once a week, Douglas was allowed to sleep in his grandfather's tower. He'd run up the dark spiral staircase to the top and go to sleep in that magician's abode amidst thunder and visions. And in the early hours of the morning, when even the milkman was not yet clinking bottles in the streets, he would wake up and work his cherished magic. Now, Mia adores the place. At the very top of the tower, a platform opens up. There you can admire the moon and greet the dawn, or sometimes both at once. Mia calls the tower visiting the sky. Mia was thin and small. There was no way she could be 18 years old, a teenage schoolgirl, that's all. Gerda interested her much more than Mark. Already getting acquainted on the porch, she was ready to caress her, but hesitated. She won't bite, she's smart. So don't be afraid. They switched to you almost immediately, though. Isabella went to the kitchen to find something to feed the young people. Mark knew that by evening she would have to leave and spend the night in the city, because early in the morning she would be waiting for a client, an intrusive uncle who wanted to make everything in his mansion to the highest standards. "I suggest green borscht." Isabella looked out of the kitchen. "How's that?" "Mia, show Mark around the neighborhood, take him to the lake." For Gerda, getting to know the area was of the utmost importance. She walked ahead of the young people. Mark was not mistaken. This green corner was deserted at this hour, golden flowers on the grass and Mia walking on his right hand. The girl was walking with her head down, as if she wanted to find something among the grass and flowers. Mark didn't feel anything wrong yet. The day was too sunny, the breeze too warm and gentle. There was no room for shadows. From this edge of the fellowship was surrounded by a wooden fence, a rather dilapidated one though. Micah ducked into a gap where a board had fallen off and waited for Mark to follow. Further on, beyond a small hill, there was a lake, marked on the maps as Pridorojnoi, though it was quite far from any roads, and just beyond the lake the forest began. Dachniks came here to catch small fish or just sit by the water. They took good photos here. The lake was small, but framed by the forest and weeping willows, it was picturesque. However, Mark's heart was suddenly racing. He saw several butterflies, big black beauties, fluttering over the water. Mark even blinked, hoping it was a vision, that he was just overheating in the sun. They couldn't be here. He had once looked up the species in a book and had learnt that they lived somewhere else. But he'd seen them several times before the news of someone's sudden death. "What do you think?" he asked Maya after all, nodding at that black dance. If she had seen it too, she would have said something like how beautiful. "The boys are swimming here." Mia shrugged her shoulders. "I tried it once and lost my footing. The bottom was too boggy. They say there's a ford somewhere. I don't know where." They settled down on the bank, right on the grass, dry and warm. Mark didn't know if he could ask Mia. Did she know anything about what she was facing? Was she afraid? But as it turns out, children know more than their parents realize. Mia started this conversation on her own. "I know why your mom called you." She wasn't looking at Mark, she was looking at the lake. "But I don't think it's worth it. There's some serious guys out there. What are you going to do with them? Even with the dog?" "What makes you think they're so serious?" he asked with deliberate carelessness. You see, Mum can keep her mouth shut, but not that serious. When she started asking me questions, she let something slip. And then I did what I could on my own. They just don't accept the weak. They have a whole series of entrance tests. A marathon not to run, but to walk with heavy rucksacks through the mountains. Not everyone made it, but they have a death cult. They are not afraid of it. You can't die, you can't play in all this, you can't immerse yourself in it, the darkness will pull you in. Who would you say that to? Mark thought. And then the epic continues. They order their own knives. Like personal magical knives. There are special blacksmiths there too, with runes and signs on the knives. And each of them has to drink blood with his knife, choose it himself, catch it and sacrifice someone. Gerda raised her head and looked at the girl carefully. Mia rubbed her head, dared her. At least a bird or a cat. There is a real gradation of victims. Forest animals are valued higher because they are harder to catch. Try to catch one, even a hare. And the highest sacrifice is a human. Mia looked Mark straight in the eye. The ultimate sacrifice is yourself. When you don't make an attempt on someone, but lie down on the altar yourself. Isabella fed him a delicious green borscht and left a fridge full of food. I'll try to be here tomorrow evening, the day after tomorrow at the earliest. I know Mia doesn't bother with cooking, at least make yourself some sandwiches and coffee. I'll leave the cutlets in the pot under the lid. Please. Now she was talking to Mark. Lock the gate well at night. They met sunsets in the tower, or rather at the very top, on the platform Mia had chosen. They drank coffee, watched the sun sink behind the lake. It's a full moon tonight, Mia said. I don't know if they believe in anything other than their sect and who they think is their master. I read a book about vampires when I was a kid. It said that vampires loved moonlit nights, and that they followed the moonbeams like a river. Mark was busy with a more mundane task. He opened a satellite map and studied his surroundings, slowly moving his finger over the map on his mobile screen. Is that a swamp? He wondered, pointing to where the holiday village ended. Not exactly. It's boggy, but it's not really a swamp. Except in spring. when the water stands for a long time, and in autumn it all thins out. But in summer the ground dries up and there are so many flowers there. What's this? Mark pointed his finger. A settlement. Look, there seems to be a path leading there, quite far from here, and I don't know whether there are houses or not. It's not a path, it's a concrete road, a slab road. And where you're pointing, there used to be a village there. It's almost gone now, just ruins. I know that a man lived there for a long time, hiding from his wife. He said he was happy there. It was quiet. How do you know all this? My father used to take me there on his motorbike. He was hoping to find the treasure. Dad had this romanticism in him. There's a mountain or a hill about 60 meters high. There's lowlands all around. And when you get to the hill, you can see everything. Dad said there's a whole network of caves and underground passages. God knows who dug them and when. It was either an underground monastery or a hiding place for bandits. Papa was always very careful that I didn't stumble or fall into anything. And he made me promise that I would never go there alone, because if anything happened there, there would be no help. No one would even know where you had disappeared. I don't know why Dad thought that. I wouldn't have gone myself, it's too far. Did you love your father very much? Unexpectedly to himself, Mark asked. It was already evening light, but it seemed to him that she had tears in her eyes. Maya nodded. Very much. Most of all, Mum is nice, but she always has things to do, always has her head full. And for my father, I knew there was no one more important than me. Do you remember your father? I've only seen pictures of him. He was quite a famous man. More than famous. Mia confirmed it. Do you have those weird eyes? You know, they're like mirrors. It seems that just a little more and something so otherworldly will be reflected in the mirrors or windows to another world. She shifted her gaze and shuddered. Look over there. She pointed towards the lake, where the darkness had already thickened. What is there? Mark lowered his voice involuntarily and wished they were still at the top of the tower, out in the open. Look at those green lights. There's two. Fireflies, maybe? They're small. I couldn't see them from up here. It's far away. You mean eyes? Mark might have wanted to make a mocking tone in his voice to cheer the girl up, but the question sounded serious against his will. No, not eyes. Maybe it was a torch. Let's get out of here. You go to your room and I'll check the gate again. And then Gerda and I will go round the estate. The dog hasn't felt threatened yet. Maybe the key word was yet. But Mark sat in Mia's room for a long time, and she told him what she had learned. About how a willing victim spends his last night among the sectarians, about the farewell ceremony and the actual sacrifice and such horrors. Finally, he noticed that the girl's eyes were beginning to slip. When he came to himself, however, he went back to the satellite maps for some reason, found the very same hill and zoomed in, as if hoping to see some traces of life there, or at least the very caves. Mark woke up to the fact that the room was cold. It was not uncommon to have frost in the morning. Now the wind must have opened the window, and Mark felt cold. Gerda put her paws on the windowsill. It was just beginning to dawn, and the sheepdog was looking out into the twilight and shivering visibly. Mark got up to shut the window more quickly, rubbed the dog on the withers, saying that now we would warm up. But Gerda was still shivering. Without realizing why, Mark went out into the corridor. The front door was closed. But as soon as the young man touched the handle, the door opened into the dark garden. Someone had opened the English lock. Mark started quickly up the stairs. He had not yet called out to the girl, though he would very much like to do so. So what if everything is safe and Mia is asleep and he wakes her up? He quietly opened the door to her room. Gerda slipped past him, and he didn't have time to stop her. The room was empty, only the white crumpled bed, the window closed. Gerda was sniffing at something on the floor. Mark crouched down and, not believing himself, touched a smeared spot of blood. They ran towards the lake, Mark following the sheepdog. The grass was damp with icy dew, the branches wet. The lake at this hour was like silver mirrors. They've crossed it, Mark thought, to break the trail. But how did they get Mia out with a knife to her throat? Not a peep then. He gazed. There was a black line drawn precisely on the water. The butterflies had lined up, marking the ford with their wings. On the other side of the lake, Gerda had picked up the trail at once, but he would have found the way without her. He had looked at the map too long. and too closely the day before to be mistaken. It was a concrete road, old, not wide, 2 slabs only. Between these slabs grass was already growing thickly. At first the road led him to a river, over which there was a bridge, a plank bridge, over which a car could pass. On the other bank were trees, huge trunks of trees uprooted, their roots intertwined and twisted, and from afar they looked like giant spiders blocking the way. Mark knew he had a long way to go. He had no doubt where Mia had been taken. It would take him hours to get there, and he would have to listen every minute to see if anyone was around. And he couldn't wait. Mark had brought his phone with him, but it was of little use here. The connection was not catching an empty white triangle in the corner of the screen. Not a single bar. Gerda realized that her master was in a hurry. She was ready to break off into a run, but then she would break away from him. She went far ahead, and she walked beside him, and Mark walked quickly, then switched to a run. The sun was already beginning to rise, showing its red side from behind the horizon, when Mark reached the abandoned village. It was a sad sight. 700 people had once lived here, but there were few reminders of it anymore. The shrubbery had grown so high that it hid the shrubberies, which had fallen into disrepair. Only the roofs were visible, and the streets were still visible. One might have thought that this place would attract those who practiced a death cult. But Mark felt there was no one here. To turn on and there would be a lake, the shores of which were so favored by vipers that it would be better not to go there without boots. To the protected mountain. The way lay straight ahead. Only the concrete ended here and there was only a path left. Now he had to be doubly careful. It was already light, and they were close. Whenever possible, Mark tried to walk at the edge of the forest without losing sight of the path, and when he noticed a long, high hill ahead, he retreated into the thicket. It was a place that all the locals tried to avoid. It was tempting, though there was a rumor that untold riches were hidden here. Who kept them here? Who knows? Bandits. Who else? But who? According to some rumors, those whose ataman was Stenka Razin, according to others, the companions of Emelian Pugashev. And whoever said it all started with the old believers. They inhabited the local caves, deepened them, and then gave permission to those who came here to escape from the authorities, or just from the evil Baron to settle in the neighborhood. It happened that the robbers stayed here for the winter, and in the spring they left for their criminal activities on the big water. But who settled in the caves now? When Mark saw the smoke, he crawled the last few meters rather than walked. Gerda knew the command to crawl perfectly well and breathed noisily. In a few minutes, Mark was already looking at the sight before him. Mia had said, like her mother, that there were about 100 people in this sect, or what the hell to call it. But now Mark noticed 12 too. For some reason it reminded him of all the reenactment clubs. Right at the foot of the mountain there was a fire, but not a strange one, not a sacrificial one, but just warming and cooking breakfast. And someone didn't care much about firewood. They used dried out wood. That's why there was smoke from it. Many of the guys were really strong physically, even outwardly it was noticeable, were dressed in some strange gray hoods or cloaks of coarse cloth. Maybe such clothes were practical here. They protected them from the morning cold and annoying midges. And they were not sorry to get dirty or burnt by sparks from the fire. But only the Middle Ages came to mind, with its bonfires and the mad eyes of fanatics. A very thin man with gray hair grown back below his shoulders was stirring the brew in a cauldron. He was older than the others, and much older. Perhaps he was the head of the sect. But Mark dismissed the thought. It was unlikely that the master would be serving the others, preparing their breakfast. What Mark hadn't expected was that the man would suddenly raise his eyes and look exactly where he was hiding in the dense foliage, and seemingly, despite such a veil, would see him. It was a total, absolute failure. And if he now called out to these boys and pointed in the direction where the stranger lurked, Mark would not escape or hide, and neither will Gerda. What will a dog do against so many people? It won't even stop them. And worst of all, no one and nothing will be able to save Mia. The man looked at him without taking his eyes off and seemed to have even dropped the spoon he was holding in his hand. Mark was also used to trusting his senses. This time he didn't feel threatened. Not only that, but he had a growing feeling that he knew this man from somewhere, even though it was impossible. Judging by his appearance, the man hadn't been out of the forest for a long time. And then the stranger's features seemed to overlap with a photograph in his memory, the one his mother had shown him. Mark blinked his eyes a lot. Wasn't James coming from the other side of the world? Or had he, after all? The man stood up and took a few steps toward Mark and suddenly put a finger to his lips. It was a gesture of invitation, saying, "Shay shall come to you now and we'll talk." Mark nodded. It was dangerous, though, terribly dangerous. Maybe the man only wanted to calm his guard and then get close, grab his shoulder with his strong fingers, and then call the others. James, or whoever it was, took his time walking toward the thicket. There was no telling what the man was up to. It was only when the branches closed behind him and Mark was 2 steps away that the man squatted down beside him and asked, "Who are you? Who are you?" was the first thing that came to Mark's mind. "I recognized you by your eyes," James said quietly. "My grandfather had eyes like that." He raised his hand, wanting to touch Mark's eyelids, but didn't. Not just gray, but like molten metal. "My grandfather, too, saw things that no one else could. Your mom's Kelly, isn't she?" "So if I'm your son," Mark whispered. "And you're really alive, why the hell have you been stuck here for so many years? Or have you gone crazy too and become one of them?" "I haven't gone mad." James was so thin that his eyes seemed to have sunken deep. "It was just that they needed me alive then, to keep me with them. And they made it clear to me that if I didn't agree, the people closest to me would suffer. Sooner or later they would have found out about your mom and got to her. So what did you do with them?" "I treated them. I needed that kind of help here, too. They also demanded to tell them everything I know about psyche hypothesis, about human superpowers. They hoped that I would teach them to be like myself, to develop the same abilities in them." "And what happened?" It sounded venomous, but James only grinned faintly. "You know better than anyone that you're born with this gift, and it doesn't come from a black master. After all these years, you couldn't escape? There are guys here with a very unhappy and broken fate. Maybe it was pity that kept me here for a long time, but I tried to escape once. So, failed caught, beaten up, and I was tracked for a long time. You decided to stay with them, even after they'd killed your friend?" Arseny shuddered and said quietly, "They didn't literally kill him. They wanted him to go with them, to live here. They showed him me on the phone, beaten up, while I was lying in a blackout. Anyway, he couldn't take it. I don't know the details. It must have been the heart. Who's in charge?" He didn't introduce himself. "I won't tell you his real name. They call him Karacourt here. He's completely mentally ill. He'd have to be on heavy medication, but that's why. Because of his weirdness, he's considered second to God. I mean, after the devil. What about you?" James apparently wanted to ask what had brought Mark here, but his son beat him to it. "So it's this Karacourt who's going to sacrifice Mia, the daughter of your best mate, tonight. Why don't you give him the knife? Will you hold a torch to the fire?" James flinched, and Mark realized he didn't know who Mia was. "Go over there, further into the woods," James said. "There's some sort of hunting lodge there, and wait. I don't know how long, maybe a long time, but I'll get her there for you." "Why should I believe you?" Mark asked. Arseny was silent for a few moments, then said sadly, "What else can you do?" Mark found the hunting lodge without difficulty, a small, old log cabin, where the two of them would have been cramped. No one had lived here for a long time, and it smelled rotten and damp inside. He let Hertha run round the neighborhood, and the sheepdog found a barely visible stream, from which they drank with pleasure, first the dog, then the master. The day was already drawing towards evening. There was still nothing to think of contacting the larger world, and Mark's spirits grew heavier and heavier. It was unlikely that Mia would be kept here for 2 whole nights. Most likely, everything would be resolved in a few hours. It would be much easier for them to drop off a body burnt beyond recognition than to hide a live girl, who of course would be searched for. Her mother would bring everyone to their feet. But now everything depended on one man, on Arseny, and he didn't seem quite normal to Mark either. How could one live for years among these ghouls and keep his sanity? Gerda was the first to hear the approach of the strangers. She jumped up, frozen like a statue. Mark put his palm on her withers. Quiet. He didn't want the dog to give them both away by barking or whimpering. James led Mia in front of him. She was barely walking. He was supporting her by the shoulder, and she too was wearing some kind of gray robe. The girl was unlike herself, tangled hair, a blank stare. "What's wrong with her?" Mark intercepted Mia. She's just been drugged. Can you smell it? And a bit of dope. She's been told she's going to be killed anyway, and this will make it easier for her to accept the inevitable. Now, get her in as fast as you can. But how will she walk in that condition? Mark asked, almost desperately. It's a long way. No one will chase you for a while. I promise. Stay close to the river, and as soon as you get a connection, call for help. Maybe they'll intercept you halfway down. What about you? If there's a willing victim, it's their favorite, James said nonchalantly, and before Mark could say anything, he was gone, disappearing into the fading twilight. One thing was certain over the years, even in this monstrous environment, he'd had those who were indebted to him, whose favor he'd won and who felt affection for him. It was because of this that he had now succeeded in getting Mia out. He sat alone until late in the evening, in the very cave where the condemned had spent their last hours, praying to himself that his son and his mate would reach the humans safely. Occasionally he sipped from a jug of the wine that was generously served to the prisoners. Better to let them go to the altar like somnambulas than to drag them screaming like pigs. James didn't think. Didn't think about himself. To be honest, he didn't want to live either. His body had survived, but his soul had been burned almost to the ground. A willing sacrifice in the eyes of the other members of the cult that justified everything. James knew that Karacourt would go ballistic. That was what happened when James was eventually brought to him. The ringleader didn't grovel to the caves. He was the only one here who had a dwelling. Psychiatry was the subject James had been worst at the Institute. But looking into those eyes, black and seemingly pupilless, and watching this extremely pale man swallow saliva that dripped down his chin, James had no doubt that he belonged in the ward behind the iron door with the bars on the window. You let her go so they could find their way to us and wipe us all out. Ends in the water. The river's close by. Consider me sorry for the girl. It's better than what you were going to do to her. James said. You took her from us. If his voice softened, it was only a little. I'll replace her. James reached out his hand towards the ajar door, and someone put a torch in it. He knew who it was. Sophia, the girl who had come to the cult last. She still couldn't get used to it. Everything longed for her mother. James raised the torch, illuminating the hut, where a single candle still burned and darkness crowded the corners. Now it was spellbound brightly. All that scary tinsel animal skins, rat skulls, acculturation books, all those black candles. The other boys still had a chance to get out. James had told his son the truth. There wasn't a person here who hadn't been broken by life one way or another. But there was only one crazy person here. You and I would make excellent victims, he said almost affectionately to the madman. James knew what was happening this minute. Sophia locking the door from the outside. Who, us? It would have been clear to anyone long ago. Karacourt still didn't understand. You and me, James explained to him. Your master has been waiting for you for a long time. He ran his hand along the walls. Old wood, how glorious it will burn. But it doesn't work like that. It's not time for me to go to the bonfire yet. The Karacourt's voice was already hysterical. James tried the torch on the towel over there, or on the robe hanging on the nail. The Karacourt rushed to the door, but James blocked his way. At first he thought it was sparks spraying from his eyes, but then he saw something out the window he'd never seen here before, the flashing beacons on police cars. Karacourt was beating on the locked door with both palms and screaming. James, on the other hand, stood with his torch down, barely able to keep his feet. He closed his eyes, relief making him want to cry. Marian Morris had long since stopped being dreamy. She had a lot to worry about in this life. Not long ago, her father had left the family, leaving his wife with an invalid mother and 3 minor children alone. The 19-year-old girl was the main helper in this family. Sometimes it even seemed that she had become a substitute for her father. The mother had a quiet, calm character, but she was never affectionate and attentive to her relatives. Especially her indifference lately extended to the elder Marian, whom she more often called Mary, and treated her as if she were a neighbor's girl. Mrs. Kimberly, a mother of many children, had another son aged 11 called Jack and a very young daughter, a preschooler named Cassandra. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Marian was not with Marcus, Kimberly's ex-husband, but with some long-time pal of the woman. Most likely a drinking buddy. She liked to get down to the bottle, just like her husband. But then one day, Marcus had an irreparable event. He suddenly had an epiphany, became more and more interested in newfangled trends for a healthy lifestyle, and attempted various diets. First, Marcus gave up his family's favorite sausage sandwiches in the morning, then all meat dishes. Kimberly began to buy more fish, which her husband had not yet given up, but this did not save their marriage. Marcus then became a raw food eater, and then starved. More and more often, instead of having a glass or two with his wife and friends, he started to go to the forest, walk there for several hours and just enjoy nature. He found adherents on social networks. Almost all of them were men and unmarried. It was interesting for the aspiring vegan to observe the lifestyle of these freedom-loving guys through photos and videos on the internet. And increasingly he was disappearing outside the house, away from his family, his children, his wife, and his sick mother-in-law, with whom his relationship never worked out. I felt life. I had to change something in my destiny. He shared these sentiments with his friends more and more often. And then one day, lying on the sofa after another inspiring walk, Marcus looked at his wife and fussing children and realized he had to leave. As Marcus packed his things, Kimberly just lay motionless in the room. Sometimes it seemed like she was sobbing, but she had found out about her husband's decision a couple of days before he left, had an argument with him, even a bit of a fight, and then just realized there was nothing she could do about it. Marcus put his arm around his son and kissed the still uncomprehending Cassandra, who had been asking him all the way, "Dad, when are you coming?" And her question remained unanswered every time. Then the prodigal father, ready to leave the house with his bags, where a taxi was waiting for him in the street, looked at Marian, who was standing aside. He approached her slowly and said, "Marian, look for yourself." The girl looked at him questioningly. "Look for yourself. Look inside, you have a light. You're going to make it." "Okay," the daughter answered confusedly. This large family was left alone, without a father, without a breadwinner, without a protector. Now both mother, grandmother, and Marian, as the oldest members of the family, began to think more and more often about how to feed the children. Marian had felt lonely almost from childhood. She had friends, some of her classmates stayed in town. Most of them had moved to places more suitable for earning and living. One such friend was Gabrielle Jones. She had known Marian since first grade. They both sat in the fan seats at the outdoor stadium, where town sporting events were often held. Marian decided to tell her friend about the recent changes in their family. "So anyway, my dad left my family." "Really?" Gabrielle put both hands on her head, trying to act dramatic. "Yeah, he just left. Packed his things, said goodbye, said some rubbish to me." "What kind of stuff?" "Yeah, it was bullshit." Marian smirked. "Look for the fire inside," said the girl. Gabrielle laughed out loud, followed by the storyteller. They were both rolling on the floor with laughter. But then, calmed down, Marian went on again. "Yes, he's been strange lately. To tell you the truth, I didn't feel sorry for him." "Strange? What do you mean?" "Going into the woods, not eating meat, and all that." "Yeah." And anyway, Marian looked away and smiled faintly. She took out a packet of cigarettes. "What?" "What? Say what you want to say." "I don't even know." It was obvious that Marian hesitated to tell her, or to keep secret what lurked in her soul. She didn't know whether to tell even her best and time-honored friend at such moments. "Marian, we've known each other so long. Maybe I'm worried." Gabrielle bought her friend a smoke and she gave in. "Yeah, they say he's not my father. I don't know whether to believe it or not." "That's weird, who's saying that?" "Mrs. Cheryl from up the street, Mom and Dad's friends. I haven't heard it myself, but it's all come to me recently. It's so annoying to be told you've heard it somewhere. I mean, everyone's talking about it now." "Yes," said Gabrielle thoughtfully. All evening and all night, Marian worried about her decision to tell her friend about the rumor, for even she did not know if it was true. Marian had worked before her father and family left, but it was more of a part-time job than a full-time job. She handed out leaflets. She was a sales consultant in a clothing shop. She traveled with goods to various addresses in the city as a courier. Now it had been decided by the family council that Marian would go to New York to work. Kimberly had already managed to call her sister, who worked in one of the grocery shops of a large chain in the city. Catherine was a receptionist and had once long ago offered Kimberly a job at an open sales position. Kimberly had been taking care of the younger Cassandra at the time, and Marian couldn't sit with her since she was already moonlighting somewhere. When Marcus left, she remembered her sister's offer. It was Marian's first day of work. She was to come to the shop and talk to Mrs. Catherine and listen to a short lecture on her job description. Marian took her packing seriously. She put on dark trousers and her best, almost unworn jumper. Her mother saw her fiddling in the mirror and putting on her makeup. "Why are you going to be a shop assistant?" she said squeamishly and almost indifferently, standing on the threshold of her daughter's room. Marian made no reply. She had long ago reduced her intercourse with her mother to a minimum and spoke to her only on business. She loved her, of course, but it was easier this way. Marian had long felt that her mother's attitude to her was mainly consumerist, and she did not want to be personally convinced of it. This woman seldom cared for the girl's personal problems. Her name had long been associated in this family with the words, help, do, and fetch. It was a long drive from small town to big New York City, where Marian had only been a couple of times in her entire 19-year-old life. She was riding on the bus and listening to her favorite music on the player, looking around at the surrounding farms and small towns along the way. Suddenly, she felt sad. The girl thought about her life in her childhood. It turns out I hardly had one. She remembered quite the early years when there were 3 of them. Her mother and father. They had been younger, funnier, and friendlier then. Her mother would hug her at times, kiss her forehead, and her father would joke merrily, tossing his little girl in the air. Father and mother drank less. They were lively, but then brother Jack was born, and relations in the family, for some reason, deteriorated. Marian was only 8, and she already had to almost run from school to sit with the baby. From then on, the girl began to feel that she was no longer perceived as before, as a daughter, as a girl, as a living person who had a beating heart inside. More and more often she began to hear, "You must, don't forget," and other words containing requests, if not orders. And less often she received words of approval, care, and love. When Cassandra was born, Marian realized that she was certainly not going to have a carefree life now, and she was right. Jack went to school, and Kimberly had her 3rd child. Marcus began drinking more and participating less in the family's life. His wife, who had many children, soon had to look for work, as he quit his job and started looking for work himself. These searches were passive, and every time he was asked about his progress, he sadly replied that there were no suitable vacancies yet, that the salary at the interview was lower than the stated salary. There were many other reasons why he couldn't get a job at his working age, being a fit and healthy man. Kimberly understood that he had no desire to get up every weekday from his favorite sofa and deny himself daily drinks with friends and watching humorous TV shows and series about the police. But what was to be done? Her husband's temper was sometimes harsh, and he could, even when he was in a depressed mood, use his hands, but not against the children. All in all, Kimberly knew she shouldn't have disturbed him. She had also hoped that he would be involved with the kids, but that wasn't happening either. You did your homework and clean up after yourself. That was usually the extent of her father's attention. During this period, Kimberly began to look more and more closely at her eldest. She was already 14 years old when Cassandra was born. One day she told the girl bluntly, "I'm working, money is tight. You need to get a job too." Marian was a serious child, and after a month she started bringing in a small income for the family. She barely had enough for her own needs. She gave almost everything to her mother. Once Marian dared to ask her why her father did nothing, and then she regretted it for a long time. So many negative words and emotions in her direction she had never heard before, became very offended. And at that moment, everything changed in her soul. If her mother did not become her enemy, then her attitude to her, seemingly to the most dear person, became indifferent. Soon Kimberly noticed this change in her daughter, and instead of discussing with her the reason for her reticence, she began to respond in the same way. They were both bound together only by their concern for Jack and Cassandra. Marian became a second mother to these children. Kimberly was not only absent from work, sometimes she arrived very late, and no one knew what the real reason for her delays was. The sick grandmother was out of the picture in this family, and in that she and Marian were alike. She lay in her room and occasionally chatted with her grandchildren. There were medicines lying everywhere, and there was almost always a television on. Marian liked to share some of her less than obvious experiences with her, but as time went on, her grandmother began to feel worse and worse. She was in the hospital or just sleeping. Her grandchildren visited her less and less. On her face one day appeared an expression of indifference to life. All these moments of her life replayed in her head mysterious black-browed girl sitting on the last row in the bus, and sometimes her eyes filled with tears. Well, at least we'll have more money, so she comforted herself at the end of her heavy thoughts. Soon the announcement was made. New York terminus. Marian sighed. She wanted to ride in this old bus, to look at the trees at home and just think, dreaming of a better life that might never come. Marian got off the bus and slowly made her way towards the city center. The stop was located on the very outskirts of town. She saw a few older houses. They were located on an elevated area. The further she traveled towards the shop, the more modern scenery she encountered. Finally, she saw a large grocery shop. It was beautiful, all glass and with glowing letters on the roof. It was a very huge building. Marian walked inside the premises. There was an escalator running right in front of the entrance. On the ground floor, there were little stalls with balloons, with unusual lollipops and different bling. And all this colorful picture briefly caught the eye of a girl from a small town, who did not often come to such crowded places. First, she wanted to buy a beautiful knitted bracelet with stones. Then she looked long and fascinated at the golden statue of a dragon. "I'd like to take one of these home," Marian dreamed. After about 10 minutes of excitement, she remembered that she had not come to go shopping, but to get a job in a grocery shop. But where was it? So it's a shopping center, I guess, she thought. The signs said the grocery shop was on the first floor. At the shop, Aunt Catherine met her niece and immediately started telling her about the duties. There were a lot of them, and one had to listen carefully. Marian knew that Catherine didn't like to repeat herself and took her personality very seriously. Perhaps that was why she and Kimberly didn't get along very well. Her sister in conversation could take offense at nothing, but seriously. Marian was issued a uniform. She was assigned a mentor, a petite blonde woman of about 45 named Selena. She spoke quietly and quickly, sometimes even slurring her words. The girl's first day as a trainee was hectic but unnoticeable. With her anxious thoughts and running after Selena, Marian didn't notice how her shift ended. 9 p.m. "You can pack up." Her mentor walked up to her. "What about you?" "Me too. Let's go to the back room and change there." "Did I work well?" Marian asked. "Yes, you've been fine. It's hard to tell from the first day." Marian calmed down. For some reason, she thought she had made a lot of obvious mistakes, but it turned out that her mentor did not notice anything, or considered all her faults as insignificant. Either way, she was glad for the end of the day, even though no one had praised her. The main thing was that she hadn't messed anything up. So a month passed, and Marian received her first salary, as well as her new position as a sales consultant. The probationary period past this event was the main success she had had recently. One day she came home and found her mother at home, peacefully making soup in the kitchen. Suddenly, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to share her achievement at work with her. She went into the kitchen, and she and her mother exchanged a few words. "No, I won't," Marian thought. "She's all about the money, and that's all that matters." Soon Marian had established herself in her position at the shop. She did her job splendidly and had no complaints about life. She was given a pay rise and once even made Employee of the Month. She was now used to sharing her successes only with herself. Her friend Gabrielle got married and moved in with her husband in Chicago. At times, Marian thought of her and even envied her happiness a little. Yet on the whole, she was content with what she had. The girl had become truly independent. And it was not only about financial independence, because now she could afford to spend more on herself. In addition to all this, she changed personally. She didn't need company at all. She didn't want to talk or listen to anyone. She worked and helped her mother with her children. It would seem that what else was needed for her? A person who had long been deprived of any ambitions. And yet she wanted to love. Marian tried to get into relationships with guys, but after a few short attempts she realized that she didn't want to be with just anyone to have fun and arrange romantic evenings. All these young people were not in a hurry to be serious about Marian. "You're a little too outspoken." Gabrielle had hinted to her in the days when they still lived in the same town. "You're a bit, I'm sorry, not feminine, are you?" she once said. Marian tried to hide the feeling of offense, but she had a great complex in her heart. She was indeed a little coarse, her voice was low, her features, though beautiful, were in many ways boyish, her nose with a hump, her slightly extended manly lower jaw, and her eyes, those brown, thoughtful eyes, in which something deep, secret, and serious was read. It had been 2 years since Marian had taken a job with Aunt Catherine. She was 21 years old and in love. Stephen Howard worked as an area manager for a shopping center and occasionally went into the shop to check on the quality of the staff. He took a fancy to an unusual black-browed girl, and she took a fancy to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His expression always conveyed good-naturedness, and the high-browed, bony blonde named Stephen was liked by all the cashiers and saleswomen in the shop, and they were not shy about exchanging a few enthusiastic words among themselves after he left. Stephen had come on board later than Marian had started working here. For 6 months they exchanged glances, but one day Stephen did get bold enough to make the first move. She was standing at the meat counter. The shop was unusually small and the clerk had nothing to do. It was the right moment for the two of them. She heard behind her, "Girl, why are we standing there? Why are we not working?" It was funny that Marian, who was tired of working days from domestic cares with her brother and sister, at first reacted to the manager's remark sharply and negatively. She turned round and stared at the man with her deep and intense gaze, squinting her thick, dark eyebrows. "I work when there's work to be done. Are all the shelves filled with merchandise? Customers don't need counseling? Is the warehouse in order?" In a monotonous and slightly raised tone, Stephen bombarded the young saleswoman with work-related questions. She stood in silence for a few seconds, not taking her stern gaze off the man, of course, realizing that she would be in trouble if she continued to be rude. It was obvious that she was facing a representative of the management. However, being in a bad mood and hurt by the phrase about idleness in her address, as well as unpleasant questions that sounded like complaints, she could not keep her discontent to herself. "I've worked here for 2 years and no one has ever complained about me. If you want to be the first to do so, be my guest." Marian had that unpleasant quality from childhood. She sometimes could not hold back her sudden anger. She'd had a couple of fights at school, the so-called shooters. There were also attacks of uncontrolled aggression, but all these moments were rare because at home reigned complete indifference. And it would be strange to behave in such a way when neither mother nor father even asked you questions about your affairs, not to mention serious conversations about studies, personal life, or smoking, standing in front of a shop management representative. For the first time in years, Marian remembered her peculiarity. Her face was covered with color, her eyes glistened, and in her soul there was both dislike and fear for her position, without which she had not seen a full life for herself and her family for a long time. Everything hung on this fragile girl. Suddenly, the stern expression on Stephen's face changed to one of mortification and contentment. He looked at the name on her badge and said in a good-natured tone, as if afraid of her hurt feelings, "Marian, I don't know your patronymic, but I can see that you are a man of character, and I hope you have a good sense of duty. A man like you should be. I didn't mean to offend you in any way. I am here to make our business grow and become as profitable as possible." Marian made no reply, but felt as if the manager still had something to say. She was not mistaken. And he continued after a short pause, "How do you get on here?" "I can't complain," she mumbled. She wanted to go to the warehouse, but sensing that the beautiful and daring and even more beautiful girl wanted to leave, Stephen decided to act immediately. He had already spent 6 months looking for her casually through the stalls. "Marian, let me give you my number, so you can be my assistant and keep me informed of how things are going in the warehouse." Marian smirked. She had calmed down a bit, and instead of irritation there was curiosity. "What do you want me to do? Rat out my colleagues?" "I'm sorry, doing what?" Stephen smiled just as amiably. "Marian, I'm just collecting employee numbers. But they're on the database, if anything." The manager was not angry with Marian. On the contrary, he found her a very interesting person, and all her mockery, inappropriate grimaces, like a lack of etiquette when talking to the bosses, only made him angry. He wanted to know more about the girl. "All right, in base, so in base I'll write to you. Go to the warehouse." Marian went away. She was filled with one great and vivid feeling. No, it was not anger. It was love at its most embryonic stage, when we are not yet sure of our feelings, and are ashamed of ourselves, ashamed of our thoughts about the person, for we know nothing about him. The same thing was happening to Marian when she just stood in the warehouse by the boxes and did not move, because her new thoughts prevented her from concentrating. Manager, what did he want from me? Bullshit. After a peculiar interaction with the new employee, Stephen approached Selena. Who is this hooligan you have working here?" He smiled at the saleswoman. Morris Selina sighed. "I think she's Mrs. Catherine's niece. That's all I know." "How's the job?" "We're responsible. Not bad, helpful." "All right, thanks, I'll be off." Stephen left the shop in a pleasant thoughtfulness, and afterwards thought for a long time about the young, tall brunette with a serious and beautiful look of big brown eyes. For a long time, neither Marian nor Stephen forced themselves to continue this informal chat. Stephen arrived a couple of weeks later. He didn't write or call her as he had promised. After chatting with the manager, the man in love immediately approached Marian and said in a loud voice, "We need to talk. Please go to the warehouse." There were salesgirls and the manager around, still not far away, and the manager did not at all want to be judged by the junior staff here in the future. He was merely pretending that he intended to reprimand the salesgirl. Marian was frightened for a moment, forsook thoughts of the beauty of her lover's eyes and lips, which in a fortnight had bored her, and thought of the dreadful thing, which was the word dismissal. They both walked slowly towards the warehouse. There was no one there, and the only witnesses to Stephen's forthcoming revelations would be the numerous boxes of foodstuffs. "Marian, I'll tell you straight away, no complaints." She looked questioningly at her boss. "I like you here, round and round. I do not want to go round. I want to try to communicate with you." She looked somewhere to the side, down, and smiled sweetly and embarrassedly, as if wanting to answer something. Her lips involuntarily shook, and a slight, but still noticeable to the interlocutor paint, covered all her beautiful face. "Well, you think, here's my number." Marian took from the man a small white card with printed lettering and logo. As he walked away, she examined it. Stephen Howard, business consultant. Below it in even smaller print was a list of his services and his phone number, the most important thing for which this business card had been handed to her. It was a beautiful time, spring. It was around this time that Marian and Stephen began dating. They didn't advertise their relationship. The territorial manager came to the shop as usual, a couple of times a month, and communicated only with those with whom he was supposed to communicate by work. He and Marian even tried not to look at each other. One day during a smoke break, Selina brought up Stephen. There were 3 female shop workers standing outside in a circle. They should have finished their smoke break sooner rather than later, as the shop was left to 2 people, one of whom was a young girl who, just like Marian, had come here a couple of years ago and knew next to nothing. Molly, the cashier, put out her cigarette butt on the rubbish bin and, carefully dropping it there, walked off into the building with a quick step. Selina and Marian took quick puffs to finish their cigarettes and go to their seats. "And our Stephen's all right," Selina, who was not particularly noted for her participation in gossip, replied cryptically. "Who do you mean, Selina?" Marian asked, though she knew it could only be about the manager. "Stephen Howard." "Yeah, he seems nice." "Marian, are you two dating by any chance?" Selina asked, and the question changed the expression on her colleague's face. "No." "What makes you think that?" "Well, I don't know, it just seemed like an experience." "I don't know what your experience is." "You're paying attention to the wrong things," Marian snorted unfriendly. "Maybe not, but just in case he's just not your best option, it's best not to get involved." Marian didn't say anything back to her. She was surprised by her colleague's words. She didn't understand why Selina started to be frank about her boss, and why she was so sure of their connection. The saleswoman wasn't fooling her, though. She had indeed speculated and just guessed that was what was called experience. The quiet, silent worker, who had never been seen discussing colleagues before, suddenly decided to share her suspicions about Stephen with the young employee. Perhaps Selina recognized Marian as herself, and Stephen resembled someone from her past life. The feelings and thoughts that had prompted her to talk remained unknown to Marian. Marian had been her own person for a long time, and she made all her own decisions. She didn't rely on anyone, and she didn't count on anyone. Stephen was a ray of sunshine that had suddenly come into her life. He was a real grown man, capable of courtship, gifts, and displays of affection. Marian had never met a man like him before. All the few partners she'd had were boys, not men, and it wasn't even a matter of age. All they could offer was a trip to a cafe and a sleepover at their house when her parents were away. Stephen, on the other hand, was a wealthy man. He was 30 years old and had already been living alone for several years in his own flat, which he had partly earned himself. His parents were honorable, educated people, and wished their son a similarly honorable party. They were both university professors, and many of their students seemed to them good candidates for the role of their son's future wife. But Stephen often referred to the busyness at work and did not come to these nice acquaintances, and if he did, all communication ended with a banal gesture of propriety. He walked the student home and wished her good night. It's not like that. Each time Stephen complained to his parents, begging them to stop these useless acquaintances. His father and mother were genuinely perplexed and asked their son what he wanted. And he only answered, "I'm a grown-up uncle. I'll sort it out myself." So what did the 30-year-old territorial manager of a large grocery chain, Stephen Howard, really want? Firstly, the man was somewhat annoyed by any desire of people, even his closest relatives, to dictate his life. He was used to being the king of his life, and only circumstances that happened to us not of our own free will could change his trajectory. No one in this world was an authority to him, only himself. Some of Stephen's acquaintances called his characteristic overconfidence, and more than once he was advised to listen to the opinions of others, and yet he did things his own way. When he succeeded in his career, he clearly realized that he was on the right path. Strangely enough, he had no clear goal in matters personal. Stephen did not strive, as his parents put it, to find a worthy party, although he was already 30. Perhaps romance lived in this purposeful and pragmatic man. There wasn't much of it, but he, just like his new love Marian, believed that you just had to find your man. It didn't matter to him that his girlfriend hadn't accomplished much in life and worked at the grocery shop in the lowest position. He liked her dark, always, as if on something focused eyes and rough, but at the same time so beautiful and attractive features of the face. Yes, he felt in this difficult, silent girl his own man. Marian had almost ceased to sleep at home. Her mother, of course, was not happy with her, although now their financial situation had improved markedly, and her daughter threw a certain amount of money into her account every month. Since Marian began to date Stephen, the amount became even greater. It was because the young man was giving her money for personal expenses, which meant that the mother was now allowed to throw even more money. Marian understood and didn't argue with her when she spoke. "You have decided to pay us off," she replied. "Yes, you may consider it so," and went to work and then to Stephen's house for the night. Stephen was in no hurry to offer to move Marian into his flat. What was it he couldn't exactly figure it out himself? Perhaps it was some insecurity about his feelings. Or maybe, despite his independence, he was still afraid of his honorable parents and ashamed of the 22-year-old shop assistant who had been his girlfriend for 6 months. In any case, after some time in the soul of this successful man, there was a certain dissonance. He as if began to slowly retreat back. 6 months later came the crisis in this unequal relationship. Marian, tired and broken, came home more and more often to spend the night. Stephen looked for all sorts of excuses not to invite her over. Her mother smirked one day when she saw her daughter on the doorstep late at night. "What, did he leave you?" Marian answered her nothing, by the way. She did not tell her a word about her young man. And so several months passed. Both did not know what to do to end this relationship once and for all, or to continue to meet in the same format, but experienced constant psychological discomfort. They arranged a warm meeting on Valentine's Day. It was a chance to set the record straight, to forgive each other for offenses and deal with misunderstandings and understatements. As luck would have it, Marian got some unpleasant news. One of the saleswomen was sick, and there was no one to work the night shift. "Marian, but I'm begging you to come out. You'll be well paid." The manager begged her. "But I have plans for tonight." Marian replied grudgingly. Probably if the manager had known with whom Marian was going to spend the evenings then, she would certainly have looked for someone else. "I'm begging you. I'll get on my knees." "All right, Bridget, don't. I'll go out." A sense of responsibility had been instilled in her from childhood, not by her mother, not by her father, but by life. And Marian couldn't refuse to help the shop she'd been working in for over a year. Still at the end of her shift, she kept walking around, twisting and turning the phone in her hands, typing and deleting text again. For some reason it seemed to the girl that if she didn't make it, her and Stephen's relationship would be over forever. Yes, she had become a little dependent on him. She liked his advances, the fact that he was a wealthy and mature man, but most importantly, having had no experience of a really serious relationship with men before, Marian quickly got used to him. Somehow she thought that this choice was the best. and she would never get another chance to find a suitable life partner. Stephen was indeed good-looking and well-to-do, but did he love her? She didn't want to think about it, because somewhere in the back of her mind, her heart felt unreciprocated. Finally, it was 9 p.m. The second shift had begun. Marian knew she had to be at Stephen's at 9:30 p.m. She had to dare to text. "I'll write it as it is. He'll think I'm responsible. He's the boss here," Marian tried to reassure herself. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen. One new message. It was Stephen. What was he trying to tell her? Marian opened the message. "Sunshine, please forgive me. I can't make it today. I'll be in an important meeting." How easy and convenient it is, being a member of the administration, to refer to important, usually unscheduled meetings. Stephen had used his position more than once to make up another story about these very important matters, but Marian had no choice but to believe him. After all, if there was no trust, then why keep in touch with the man? She wrote him that she was also busy, that she was put on the night shift, using the warmest and sweetest words. Stephen felt sorry for his girlfriend and wished her a brisk shift. Almost 3 hours passed, there were less and less people in the shop, and thus less work too. Marian was thinking more about her personal problems than about customer requests and groceries. It was unusual for her to work after 9 o'clock, and she was beginning to feel a little drowsy. There was a sudden appearance. Scarlett appeared in the shop, the same sickly shop assistant. Marian was a little puzzled. What was she to do now? "Marian, hi. It's okay, I can do it. I'm free," the woman said. "Yes, but Bridget." I rang. Marian shrugged. She went to the back room to change. She hated to humiliate herself in front of Stephen, but his flat was the only place close to the shop where she could spend the night. She realized he had no intention of seeing her. He might already be asleep or out of the house, but it was still better than catching a taxi in a foreign city past midnight. Maybe he'll at least pay for my taxi, she thought. As it happened, Marian had hardly any money with her, and she certainly wouldn't have enough for the ride home. After 3 messages asking for a bed for the night, or at least for help, Marian began to call Stephen, but all her efforts were in vain. He must have been very busy. She stepped outside, breathed the fresh February air into her chest, and headed for the bus stop. There are times when you know you're doing something reckless, but you walk on, as if you're too lazy to stop, think, and make another, more difficult decision. That's what happened to Marian, who all in her thoughts walked slowly to the bus stop, knowing that all the buses had long since gone away. Marian sat down on the bench once more, checking her phone just in case. It hadn't received a single call, not a single message. Of course, she could have called one of her friends and mates, asked to borrow money and hail a taxi. She could have gone back to the shop and spent the night in the back, but her eyes fell on the very few old houses she had noticed the first time she had come here for a job interview. The houses were old and shabby, but still people lived there. Marian was sure that on the ranch there would be some old man or woman who would be kind enough to shelter her till morning and give her a good meal. At least that's what fairy tales and good films and serials about lost people teach us. She walked towards the houses. A window was burning in one of them. Without thinking long, Marian headed towards the light. She approached the wicket, in the yard of the property through the darkness. The girl saw a large foreign car that looked like an SUV. Though the wicket was closed, the hook could be easily lifted from outside the lot. Marian decided to go in to knock on the door. She reckoned that was what the locals here did. Slowly moving around the lot, she got a little look at the property. There was probably a garden under the windows. There were pegs sticking out from under the snowdrifts that looked like the planks of an ornamental fence. There were fruit trees growing close to the fence. She knocked on the door, and a man soon came knocking. "Who's there?" said a tall male voice. "I missed the bus. I don't know what to do." Well, the man said slyly. He sounded elderly. Marian saw before her a skinny old man a little taller than herself, with a long beard and sparse long hair. He was gray-haired. His thin features did not have a particularly aged look. On the contrary, there was something naive, childlike about them. The old man looked at Marian and smiled. He expected to hear her story. "I didn't catch the bus. I don't know what to do." "Aha, aha." The grandfather said fluently, "I heard that. In short, I don't want to beat around the bush. Can I sleep over?" "Sure, come in, come in." Marian at first became frightened. Crossing the threshold of the house, she felt some hostile aura and even wanted to leave. But the old man turned and said good-naturedly, as if sensing that his manners were not to the liking of the uninvited guest, "We have only good people here, and everybody knows me, and I know everybody. Don't worry, girl. Lie down in a small room and rest until morning." The lively interest in his eyes and sly voice dissolved somewhere, and Marian became easier to communicate with this man. She remembered about the foreign car in the yard. "Do you drive?" My son drives. He comes here with his wife. This time he decided to leave it here. I don't know why." Grandpa went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and from the kitchen I heard something. "Do you want something to eat?" "No, thanks." "Well, at least store-bought cakes with tea," replied the guest. While grandfather was fussing in the kitchen, Marian began to look at his home. It was quite decent. There was a plasma TV on the bedside table, and although the furniture was simple and old-looking, the house was clean and tidy. The sofa was populated with a new bedspread of expensive fabric. It seemed as if someone was constantly caring for this dwelling, and judging by the nature of that care, it was hardly the owner. "Yes, my name is Michael Taylor." An elderly man came into the living room with a plate of cakes in his hands. "Marian." The girl sighed tiredly. "Are you sleepy? I'll get some tea." He left again, and Marian felt her heart finally calm down and beat in a familiar rhythm. Marian ate the cakes and drank tea alone, and the master went away again. He came half an hour later and announced that the room was ready. She had gone to spend the night in a strange place, lying in a strange bed, and this moment, of course, embarrassed her. Lying under the covers, she stared at the burning screen of her phone. Such a strange thing was happening to her. She wanted to share her impressions with at least someone, but then she realized, who should I write to? And having put the phone on the bedside table, she fell asleep in the sound sleep of a baby. Tired and spiritually distressed for the day, Marian decided to get out of bed as soon as her eyes opened for the first time that morning. Despite Michael Taylor's apparent hospitality and kindness, she felt uncomfortable being in someone else's home. She glanced at the clock on her phone, 5:27 a.m. Getting up at this hour was certainly difficult, but still Marian made an effort on herself. If I pack quickly, I can catch the bus, she thought. Marian sat down on the edge of the bed and stretched, slowly so as not to wake the elderly owner of the house. She tucked her phone and charger into her bag, looked in the small mirror that hung on the wall, and opened the door to the living room as carefully as she could. The landlord was apparently asleep. He was lying on the sofa, covered with a plaid, with his back to the exit. A few steps separated the girl from the exit. She paused. Maybe I should thank him. At least say something. No, I won't make the bus. She turned towards the door and continued her slow step. After a few seconds, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It couldn't be anyone else. Marian turned around. A satisfied Michael Taylor stood in front of her with a sly smile that pushed her away. Still last night. It wasn't as if the man had just woken up. It was as if he had been invisibly watching his guest since the moment she awoke. Marian became frightened. She was a truly desperate girl at times, and yet she was the weaker sex. And there was a strange man standing in front of her, and this man was clearly not going to let her go. Michael now seemed stronger, taller, and more confident to her. Were these sensations contrived from fear, or had the master, all the time the girl had been in his possession, been trying to appear feeble, bending and grimacing to make Marian believe he was pitying her? She did not know, but it was urgent to get out of this house and not make a mess of things. "Darling, where are you going? And who's going to pay for it?" He gave his victim a sly look. "Look, I'm going to leave now. I have no money, but I'll pay you back. Now I can." Marian began to dig frantically in her bag to find her purse. She pulled it out and took out several 100 notes. "Hisham," the old man chuckled softly. "Do you have a phone number? I'll text it to you or your son. Here's 400. Put the money away." Breathing heavily, Michael said. The elderly owner abruptly sat down and began to pull off the girl her dark, tight skirt, which she had decided to wear the day before, as February had been warm and sunny lately. Marian immediately began to struggle with the rascal. She tried for his shoulders to push him away from her, but he pressed himself against her, wrapping his arms around her legs. Marian felt as if she were falling. They lay struggling for a while. Michael slapped Marian on the cheek. "Shut up and obey, or you'll get in trouble. I'll say you attacked the old man." Marian didn't expect that this man could be so dangerous and strong. She started to scream, and he immediately put his hand over her mouth. Feeling that he had little strength to completely defeat the girl, Michael began to beat her mercilessly on the face, trying to suppress her will, but he did not know that Marian had in her soul so strong an undisclosed anger that only give the will to show itself and terrible things would happen. This anger was like a sleeping bear that had been teased by people. The more they irritate him, the stronger his desire to tear his offenders, and only the cage separates fools from death. Unfortunately for Michael Taylor, a lusty old man, who thought of raping a girl in unpleasant circumstances in the middle of the night, Marian was a warrior in her 22 years. She herself didn't fully know what she was capable of. The blows to her face had pissed her off, and she no longer saw the lonely old man in front of her as a monster and a murderer. Marian bit into his neck, and he loosened his grip a little and groaned. Still, it wasn't working to break free from his tight embrace. Michael continued to beat his victim. At some point, she felt sick to her stomach and decided that this was the end. She was ready for violence to stay alive. Her skirt was almost off. The scumbag was already fumbling with her underwear. Marian could not stand this nightmare. She suddenly screamed so frantically that Michael was just in a daze and finally let her get free. It seemed to run free, call people for help, but this feeling couldn't stop. It was charged and demanded some sort of outlet. Marian, strangely enough, in defiance of the sense of self-preservation she had had until a few minutes ago, took a sharp step towards the kitchen. From there she picked up the heaviest-looking utensil, a cast-iron skillet, and dashed into the room. Before she realized it, Michael was lifting himself up on his hands to get up, but he was still sitting on the floor. He instantly became the victim, not the hunter. Terrified, the old man looked at the furious girl with the frying pan and only had time to open his mouth, probably preparing an exculpatory speech, pitying words to be pitied and spared, but it was not to be. A blow, another blow, and he fell to the floor, sprawled on it senseless. Marian didn't know if her attacker was still alive, but she immediately called an ambulance and the police. She sat at her desk in a small armchair beside the body of her failed rapist and propped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Thoughts of criminal responsibility began to cross her mind. At 16, when she was still at school, she'd been interested in the law for a while. At home, there was a thick book on the shelves called Legislation. At first, Marian just opened and closed it, and then for fun began to learn by heart the names of articles and their numbers. The number 105 came to mind. Would I get 105 or not? Would I have a chance of not going to jail? This is self-defense. Marian was not sure that she would not be given the article for murder, but she was more inclined to manslaughter. In any case, the girl was scared, because in front of her, perhaps there was a corpse of a man and an elderly man, and she was in someone else's house. Marian went to the mirror. Her face was already beginning to show signs of beatings, and that was to her advantage. She calmed down a bit, sat back in her chair, and continued to wait for the police and ambulance. Finally, after half an hour, Marian waited for the one she had been anxiously awaiting. It was still dark outside, and the people of the neighboring houses must have been asleep, but on hearing the noise of the cars, the gawkers hurried out from behind their fences, and there were those who formed a large crowd around Michael Taylor's property. Murdered my granddad, the bastards, thieves, I suppose. He'd been giving up lately. These and many other phrases from the gawkers could be heard by ambulance and police officers. "What happened?" shouted a woman from the crowd. "We're looking into it," replied the paramedic briefly. People wanted the truth. They were eager to know it. They couldn't just leave the place and wait for the first rumors from the most clever neighbors in the area. Michael Taylor was generally well regarded by the people, though he had not lived here long. Most people thought he was a peaceful and quiet grandfather, cared for at times by his son and daughter-in-law. The police asked Marian a few questions, to which she answered as honestly as possible, believing there was nothing to hide, and concealment of the facts of what had happened, as she knew, was punishable by law. The girl was put into a police car, and as she walked along, accompanied by two men in uniform, people stared at her in silence. When she got into the car, people started whispering among themselves again. "What a nightmare. These young people have gone," shouted someone from the crowd. A little later, the doctors finished their work and carried out an elderly man on a stretcher. His face was not covered, and the villagers, seeing this, breathed a sigh of relief. The police had left, the ambulance had left, forensic experts had rushed to the scene. There was nothing to see here, as they were mostly inside the house. People went to their homes to sleep, and some people went about their daily business. The women, who were particularly impressionable, could not recover from what they had seen for a long time. They became afraid for their own lives. Nothing illegal had ever happened in this area, and no one, of course, did not expect that a murderer would come to the quiet place where mostly pensioners lived. A little later, grandparents began to go to each other and discuss what had happened. Some were even pleased that something worthwhile could finally be discussed. Barbara stopped by to see her friend Vanessa. "Vanessa, did you hear? Did you see what happened? Everyone's alive, old people are being slaughtered. Why, what was Michael's problem?" "Yeah, I saw and heard. I was standing there this morning." "What do they say?" "She's a young girl." She was young, but the weird thing is, she called the police and the ambulance. "Wait, what are you doing?" Barbara glared at her friend. "You're justifying her." "She's not here. I'm just saying it's weird. They're all bastards. They don't spare us old people. She came in, she wanted money, she wanted to make a profit, and Michael turned her down." "Yeah, I guess that's what happened." Prejudice was firmly planted in the woman's mind. She couldn't imagine anyone making excuses for someone who'd done grievous bodily harm to an elderly man. Not she. No one else in the area wanted to think that Michael Taylor was at fault, even though everyone knew that the girl had not run away but had stayed at his house until the police and ambulance arrived. And everyone knew about the oddities of the grandfather living at the entrance to the village. Marian was young and healthy, her victim, on the contrary, elderly and weak. And who would have thought that he wanted to rape his overnight guest, who out of desperation had risked spending the night with one of the residents of this ill-fated neighborhood? The investigation began. Michael was still in intensive care, but the doctors gave him a positive prognosis. Marian recounted all the details. She indicated the approximate time of events, talked about the nuances, answered all the questions put to her. In general, actively cooperated with the investigation, and the investigators saw that she was sincere, and her eyes were burning with the desire to get out of the detention center as soon as possible, to be acquitted. It was not only her unenviable position that marred Marian. Perhaps even more unpleasant was the fact that during her 5 days in the detention center she had never been contacted. There had been no messages or calls from either her mother or Stephen. Marian had wanted to call them both several times, but had hesitated. Something kept her from doing so. She wanted to be interested and waited for the call. So she felt that besides anxious thoughts about her future fate, she had other worries on her mind. And though they were not good either, yet in this way the girl was able to dilute her fear a little. Marian realized that she needed a good lawyer, and she still couldn't stand it. And while the investigation was dragging on and Michael had not yet come to his senses, it was worth worrying about her defense. After 5 days in the detention center, she called Stephen and told him everything. "Really, why didn't you call before?" he asked in confusion. "I was hoping you would call." Stephen had nothing to reply to these words. He really hadn't been concerned about her all these 5 days. Marian had only called the shop manager, and Marian thought that she might have told the others about her trouble. But to her surprise, her beloved Stephen knew nothing. "Do you need a lawyer?" he asked Marian. "Yes, I'm ashamed to ask for your help, but if you don't, no one will." "Tell me, didn't you defend yourself?" "Yes, I told everything to the investigation. Why such questions, Stephen?" Marian experienced emotional tension and was even annoyed when she heard the words of doubt from Stephen. He hurriedly reassured her. "Marian, it's okay, calm down. At least come and check on me. The lawyer will be you in which detention center you are sitting." Marian told him the number of the detention center. When she hung up, she realized that he didn't even want to visit her. He was evasive. Marian never called her mother. Somehow she wasn't particularly surprised by this. Disinterest in her daughter's life was a trait that had characterized Kimberly almost all her life. She had always regarded the girl as an obligation. And now, after a week without hearing from her, she concluded that she would come forward sooner or later. But if she is in distress, this important question was absent from the mother's mind in grief. "Morris, you have a visitor." Marian heard from the guard. A lawyer had come to see her, and her first question to him was, "Who are you from?" Stephen had not lied. He had sent his man to her, and he was ready to take up her case seriously and intimately. Mr. Christopher immediately reassured the defendant. It's not a difficult case, just tell it like it is. Marian sighed, having to recall again the terrible story of the lustful owner of the house on the edge of the city. After about 20 minutes of careful listening, Mr. Christopher, a thin man, brunette, glasses, with a concentrated face, crossed his palms and moved a little closer to the accused. You've done well, this is all very important. I think we're going to win this case. I'd like to believe that. Shaking her head slightly, sadly, looking somewhere away, Marian said. You know, by the way, that our Michael Taylor is already in the ward. Awake, will soon testify. A strong color stuck to Marian's face. She was frightened. This must be bad. Believe me, I have a lot of experience in these cases. He won't make it. Of course, he'll tell his stories. It's a very good thing you're left with a clear beating. You have no motive. You stayed at the scene of the crime. Nothing was stolen. You can just calm down and wait for the exit. Mr. Christopher collected his papers in his briefcase, and after saying goodbye and wishing Marian patience, he left. Dad, what's wrong? Well, you tell me, come on. A large, tall man in shirt and trousers almost ran into the room. He looked about 40 years old and was in an agitated state. How did they let you in, quarantine? The grandfather looked at his son in surprise. Dad, they let me in. And let me in. The man sat down on a chair near his father's bed. He looked at him patiently, waiting for some explanation of what had happened. Why, you don't know anything yourself, lawyer. Dad, I know everything. I want to hear you. Is she some kind of psychopath? She didn't even take anything. She wanted to kill me. Michael got up from the bed in a state of near rage. Well, calm down, Dad, calmed his son, gently put his hands on his shoulders. Lie down, rest if you want. Let's not talk about it now. No, you started it. I'll continue. Sadist, she wanted to kill me. How do I know why? Michael Taylor was clearly in a bad mood. His son Edward was determined to derail the conversation. In between asking him questions about his health, about the hospital kitchen and the doctors, he decided that he would have to come again when his father had calmed down and was ready to talk about what had happened in his home without emotion. For Marian, the time spent in the isolation ward dragged on at a terribly slow pace. Mr. Christopher had failed to fully convince her that her actions would qualify as self-defense. Some uncomfortable feeling could not leave her, as if everything was not so simple in this case. On the eve of the hearing, Mr. Christopher once again went to see his client. He was in high spirits and simply confident of victory. Marian, don't worry, everything will be fine. Tomorrow be sure and say everything as you told me. You were in agitation, plus self-defense, attempted rape. That'll put our Michael Taylor in jail, Marian's lawyer said with a smile on his face. The convict was silent for most of this conversation, just nodding and occasionally speaking. I see. The closer the trial got, the more anxious she felt. The night before the trial, Marian remembered her mother, brother, and sister. She had a strange feeling that the family had a life of its own, and that they were not her own people. Little by little, she began to involuntarily forget their images and memories associated with the house. The trial began in the morning. Marian prepared herself for the trial. She had her hair combed and even put on a little makeup and wore a clean change of clothes that she had taken with her to the detention center. She looked like a normal, decent, and civilized girl. The image at the trial had to play a positive role. In her case, it was important. Many had already labeled Marian a dangerous criminal, a marginal, and a thief. There were rumors that Michael was not the first victim of the killer, and that she dealt exclusively with lonely pensioners. But this time she had a serious client. Everyone in the area knew of Marian's blunder. Marian sat behind the bar and watched the people entering the hall. She said hello to Mr. Christopher, and he once again cheered her up by saying, "It's going to be fine." Marian Morris. Some of Michael's neighbors came in. Marian hadn't seen them, of course, and wouldn't remember them, but they were elderly people, outwardly different from the city folk, and she concluded that it was Michael's support group that had come. She saw him too, but immediately looked away. He still disgusted her. Sitting next to him was apparently his lawyer, a tall, statuesque man in his mid-40s. The most unexpected thing for the defendant happened when a woman and her teenage son, who were very familiar to her, entered the courtroom. It was Kimberly and Jack, Marian's mother and brother. She stared at them for a long moment, wonderingly trying to meet her mother's gaze. Jack waved his hand to his sister, but her mother immediately cut him off. She did not look at her daughter, feeling that she was looking at her. Why did she come here? And with Jack thought Marian. The hearing of the case began. When Michael's lawyer introduced himself to Marian, she turned pale. His last name was Taylor, the same as her abuser's. She stared at his face, then shifted her gaze to the victim. Yes, they did look alike. Was it really his relative? His son Marian no longer expected anything good from this trial. Though her defender, Mr. Christopher, looked quite confident in his statement, but when his opponent began his speech, he began to listen carefully to his words. The speech was filled with complex language, and everyone with a little knowledge of the law realized that this man was serious and knew his case well. Many were also struck by the emotionality with which he spoke about the case. Especially attentive guessed what was the reason for such an ardent concern of the lawyer to the old victim, who risked to become the accused that day. Alas, it did not happen. Against all sound logic, against Mr. Christopher's efforts, and against all the facts that had been presented to the court, Marian was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for robbery. Hearing the judge's words, Mr. Christopher's face changed. What assault? He addressed the judge so that no one could hear him. What's the matter with you? Mr. Christopher, sit down and calm down. You'll appeal if you have to. The judge answered him calmly. The man looked shattered. He had lost, a rare event in his 20 years of practice. Marian saw the bailiffs as they approached. She watched Mr. Christopher's face, hoping he would look at her, though she didn't know why she wanted to make contact with him. He stood gloomily for a moment in one place, and pretending to be so puzzled that he had forgotten Marian, walked slowly towards the exit. Mr. Christopher, what now? Marian shouted. The bailiffs had already entered the defendant's cell, the girl's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Christopher disappeared into the crowd of spectators leaving the hall. Marian was still in the detention center for some time. She kept waiting for Stephen's call, still unwilling to accept the fact that she would soon be a prisoner. Maybe they'll reconsider, appeal, she thought, sitting within the 4 walls of this horrible room she was never supposed to enter. Finally, Marian got a phone call. It was her young man, though she wasn't sure anymore. His voice was initially depressed, and that didn't bode well for Marian. Well, what is it? In a pleading voice she asked. Yes, Marian, you see, Mr. Christopher is a very good lawyer. I paid him a lot. He didn't expect this, you know. The thing is, this Edward, he's the freak's son. But not only that. What else? He's a powerful lawyer. I heard that Michael, this weirdo in there with them, did not want to live with them in the city. Wanted to his native village, where he grew up. All these long summarizations were not only unnecessary for Marian, but also irritating. Unable to bear it any longer, she asked Stephen. Why are you telling me all this? Is it bad or not? Marian, I don't have that much money. Mr. Christopher told me the amount, but it's a lot too. Others will take even more. And this one is an acquaintance. How much, Stephen? Marian asked, almost crying. Well, 1 million. We, of course, on friendly terms agreed that half of the amount in case of loss he will return. But you know, 100,000,000 I cannot get nowhere. But it's just 1 million. Stephen, I'm going down, you know. There was an uncomfortable silence at both ends of the wire. Stephen kept silent because he didn't want to offend or upset the girl. Marian said nothing. She waited for his final answer. Marian, finally softly spoke Stephen. Well, first of all, it is a colony of settlement. It is not strict regime, and secondly, well, 5 years and parole. I'm sure you will go out on parole. These words were too horrible for Marian. She hung up the phone. Marian, hello. On this day, Territorial Superintendent Stephen Howard decided to take no further interest in this girl's life. When she tried to call him for help and made her most fatal and possibly stupid decision of her life to go to a sleepover with a stranger, he was having a great time with a nice lady who had been waiting for reciprocation from him for a long time. Lately, Stephen had been unsure of his feelings for the young and simple girl Marian, because one way or another he was influenced by the opinion of those around him. He was independent and had no authority, but one day he himself thought that he felt uncomfortable in the company of a shop girl, or maybe he just took and changed because people change. Marian Morris, a 24-year-old shop assistant at a grocery shop chain. The girl, circumstances that one day did not work out in her favor, went to the colony. At first she was scared, but fortunately in the colony of settlement lived, and quite decent, not broken by prison women. It was to such women that the newcomer tried to get closer. Still, sometimes she had to show her teeth here. Like in the men's prison, this colony had its own chief or pahanka. Her name was Jennifer, and this was the 4th time she had been here. One had to respect this imposing woman with a not very feminine tattoo on her arm. There were always a few female settlers walking beside her like jackals. All of these women were unpleasant in appearance. From their appearance you could roughly determine their articles. One was a thief with experience. Another killed her husband in another drunkenness. But Jennifer herself, already in the 4th time, caught in a major fraud. She began her dirty career with an assistant to a serious businessman and part-time criminal mastermind of the city, and it was back in the 90s. Young Jennifer liked to live life to the fullest, and even after the first walk, she decided not to stop there and become even more successful. Except that the woman never wanted to earn according to conscience. She had no children, no husbands, and somewhere in her hometown remained an unhappy mother. Not long ago, who learned from neighbors about the criminal biography of her daughter, Jennifer all told her that she went abroad for a long time, and she piously believed her and even rejoiced for her in anticipation of seeing her only beloved daughter again. But through one of her neighbors, the truth was accidentally revealed. It was before Jennifer's last conviction. She and her mother had had a terrible fight, and in her heart, her daughter called her some very nasty words and left. A few weeks later, she had another case she wanted to drop because it was quite a risky move, but remembering the difficult conversation with her mother, she decided, okay, nobody needs me here anyway. And again, Jennifer and several of her partners had to go to jail for fraud. Marian was settling in. It wasn't so bad. She found something new to do here. She started sewing often, even when her working hours were over. She was also fond of beading, and this activity calmed her and temporarily removed all bad thoughts from her head. Somewhere in the sewing room on a shelf there was a magazine with weaving schemes. That afternoon Marian studied it and asked one of the inmates, the shop manager, to get some beads so that she could make crafts from the magazine. Margaret, the supervisor's name, was a kind and understanding person, and to Marian's delight, in a couple of days she brought her a large amount of material for her new creation. Her meditations, sitting on her bunk and threading the little balls on the thread one by one, Marian began to forget all her troubles, enjoying her work, which almost from the beginning she had been doing well. Interrupting her positive thoughts, 4 women entered the cell. Jennifer was among them. Marian was afraid of this bulky woman, partly because she almost never walked alone, and many colonists had told of her cruelty. Jennifer looked at Marian with a contemptuous smile, who pretended not to notice the women who had entered the room. But how could she not notice them? "What are you doing in business, new girl?" Marian's plowwoman asked impudently. Realizing from Jennifer's tone that she did not come in peace, Marian decided not to answer anything. "I made up a nickname for her, Beads," shouted one of Jennifer's 6. All but the main one appreciated her friend's joke and laughed too. It was an unpleasant sight. These ladies were clearly out of the local color of the colony, which in general was not so bad. "All right, I'm not supposed to be quiet around here. Last name, first name." Jennifer spoke. "Marian Morris." Marian put her work aside and looked at the woman. The newcomer's eyes were full of a confidence uncommon to newcomers, and a kind of desperate insolence, which was of course bad form for someone like her. "Are you so bold?" Jennifer asked in surprise. Marian again made no reply, thinking the colonist's behavior a provocation. Her behavior offended the unspoken leader of the colony. "Well, I hear you've been weaving your stuff around here, that you've started selling it, but that's not the way it works. So 80% of your shit is coming to me. Look, it'll be under control." Marian remained stubbornly silent. She picked up her weave and continued working as if they had all left the cell. "Have you learnt everything?" No, Marian answered. "But then, now the girls will crush you a little." And for a few moments Jennifer waited. She hoped that Marian, under the pressure of the threat, would agree to her unprofitable business plan. But alas, she gave her friends a gesture, and they began to approach Marian. A fight broke out. Jennifer, as former prisoners, calculated everything. Almost no one was in the building of the colony. All went to community service. The administration was usually eating lunch at this time, and there were no guards here to monitor the prisoners. Marian didn't scream for help. She wasn't the tiniest girl, but she had never been in a fight before. She reckoned that this was her first time as well, for against Michael she was rather just defending herself. Of course she couldn't do it against 3 men, but she remembered the feeling of overwhelming rage she had felt when the man responsible for her mangled fate had touched her underwear. Jennifer's girls had had it. For one ended with a broken nose, for another with a black eye and a nail-scarred cheek. Still, Marian was beaten. She lay on the floor, holding her stomach. It only hurt, but surprisingly she did not feel fear, resentment, or despair that day or later. Marian lay on the floor for some time, beaten by the felons, though she was able to get up. Then she crawled quietly from the floor to her bunk and put her hands on her head. She thought about her future fate in this place. Jennifer, strangely enough, had stopped pestering the needlewoman who had appeared in the colony and had told her own not to hurt her either. "Morris, don't touch her. She's a hard woman of ours. I heard that she wanted to kill the old man who was bothering her," she told the girls. The colony's chief gangster even developed a certain sympathy for this young prisoner with a beautiful and rare name. Marian worked exclusively for herself, giving her trinkets to the girls and women with whom she most often socialized, or even selling them. One day, one of the prison authorities took an interest in her work, and that's how Marian got her first big money in prison. The work was painstaking, but the necklace of pink flowers came out simply amazing, and all in joy the customer paid her $2,000 for her hard work. Soon Marian decided to follow the example of some other women from the colony who had been in captivity for a long time and were beginning to go mad from the monotony of their lives. Some of them also began to weave beads, and some of them sewed clothes from patterns, and there were also those who simply embroidered cross-stitch, so to speak, for the soul. "And you have brought creativity into our society. Look, everyone is doing something. Lillian sits all day long and embroiders her flowers." "Yes, I can see it's fun," Marian smiled. Linda was the nicest person she had ever met. She was not only interesting to talk to, but also to share her feelings. This prisoner had a feeling of caring for Marian and her fate. She was the first to hear the story of the lustful old man from whom she had to defend herself. At first, Marian's story shocked her, and she could not calm down for a long time, asking her friend about the case, whether it was possible to appeal against the court decision, and whether there were people ready to fight for her. Then, having learnt that the girl had a bigger problem in her free life than her criminal record, namely the complete indifference of all her relatives and acquaintances, including her mother, Linda calmed down and stopped asking her uncomfortable questions and just sympathized with her. A year passed. No one had visited Marian once during that time. At first, listening to stories of women about how their visits with their mother, with their son, with their husband had gone, she became sad and even at times wanted to cry. Then she got used to this pain and dissolved in her daily activities. So in beading, community service, socializing with good girls from the colony, and thinking about life after prison, 2 more years passed unnoticed. Marian turned 27 years old. She was young, beautiful, and forced to sit in jail only because she had prevented a lusty old man from being abused. A few days after her birthday, which she celebrated in a tight circle of good friends, Linda among them, she was summoned to the office of the colony director. Marian was terrified and told Linda about the event. "Yes, wait. Why are you nervous?" Linda hurried to calm her friend. "I don't know. What if I did something wrong? Maybe it's because of the sale of their products." "Well, you told me that Cheryl Jones ordered something from you." "Yeah, that's why it's weird. I've been trying to remember for 3 years, and I can't figure out where I went wrong." "Look, what makes you think it's something bad? What's good?" Marian grinned nervously. The girl, even though she liked the life in captivity lately, she was counting the days until she left the colony. She had only 2 years left, and again she could live as a human being in freedom. However, thinking about it a little deeper, she began to get a little upset. "I'll get out, but what then? Where to go? I won't go to my mom. I won't go to Stephen, but he won't expect me." Marian knew that she would have to look for a job and a place to live. And these thoughts burdened her, and yet Marian looked forward to freedom. Like most of the women in the colony who'd come here, some for robbery, some for theft, and some like her by coincidence by life's injustices. She walked slowly to her boss's office, fearing not only bad news from him, but illegal actions. Now, after the incident with Michael, she was afraid of strange men, and willy-nilly in ambiguous situations the girl was frightened. She became uncomfortable and frightened. "Marian Morris, why are you standing there?" "I'm waiting for you." The headmaster, a man in his 50s with a full head of gray, looked out of the office. "Hello," Marian replied briefly. William Butler, that was the name of the director of the colony, politely asked the prisoner to sit down. As she entered the office, she immediately noticed the woman sitting at the large desk to the left of the director's desk. Now she was no longer so afraid of William Butler. The woman was Amanda Hill, a social worker who had worked with the female prisoners here for a long time, and she had a kind face. The colonists loved Amanda. Yes, she could not solve all the burning questions of her wards, but she always sincerely tried to help people in their trouble. And just a personal conversation with her was sometimes a balm to the soul of these women. Amanda had no children, and she seemed to give all her motherly love to them. "Marian Morris, how are you enjoying your stay in our institution, so to speak?" William Butler chuckled slightly at his own words, shifting his gaze from Marian to the teacher. "It's fine, I like it." Marian was startled, and it was noticeable. "Marian Morris, can I ask why you're so tense right now?" Amanda addressed the prisoner. "I'm worried," Marian replied. "Why should you be worried?" Smiled William Butler, who, according to Marian's findings, had been a lively and cheerful man that day. There was silence. William Butler was staring at some papers. Perhaps it was a file on the prisoner Morris. Amanda Hill was careful not to let Marian notice her gaze. "All right, ladies, well, Marian Morris, your lawyer, Mr. Christopher, has filed a motion with the court for your parole." "How?" Marian was surprised. "Didn't you know anything?" "No." Marian was confused. Stephen hadn't reported in for 3 years. Was it Mr. Christopher's own initiative? She could not believe that she might be able to get out of the colony early. The prisoner's face changed visibly. She was radiant with joy. But she tried not to show it and listened attentively to William Butler. "So you talk to Amanda and she'll tell you everything. There'll be a medical examination soon, mind you, and then the trial. In general, I've written you the most positive characteristic, because we here with comrades know about your hobbies, that you sew there, or beadwork, you're about to do it, and that you have a positive influence on the inmates of the colony. In general, the main thing is not to worry and believe in the best. So the court will decide." Marian asked anxiously. "Yes, the court will decide everything, but we are for you." Marian thanked William Butler for the good news, and together with Amanda they went out to talk. As they wandered around the large colony grounds, they chatted about the parole process. Marian asked the educator with great interest about how it would go and what she herself had to do to be granted parole. At night before she went to bed, she was full of bright new impressions and thought of Mr. Christopher. Why did he help her? Marian was quite sure that the man had already forgotten her in that unpleasant case. It had been a long time since she had thought of him, but as it turned out, he not only remembered, but was willing to help her. The medical board found no reason to deny Morris parole. A little later, a hearing was held in the local court, where the only familiar face in the room this time was Mr. Christopher. The hearing was quick and successful. The result was the granting of the application for conditional early release of the convict under the article robbery, which meant that in 10 days, young, beautiful, and still not broken, believing in the best, Marian Morris was waiting for her long-awaited freedom. She already knew about it from the words of ex-criminals who had once been released on parole. It was the beginning of March. Although the whole earth was still covered with snow, and in general in nature there were almost no signs of spring, Marian felt it with all her body and with all her soul. She wanted to shout, "Freedom!" But the girl's quiet disposition prevented her from doing so. She stood for some time near the high fence with barbed wire, smoking and greedily gulping the air, which this day seemed much sweeter than before. Well, Marian went to her hometown, and this time she had money with her, and there she rented a place to live. In this she was helped by one of her acquaintances, with whom they had established good contacts while Marian was still in the colony. They began to communicate even more often than before. No one helped Marian with work. She soon found a job as a saleswoman at a cash register. The problems of the former prisoner began almost immediately after the beginning of life on the outside. It was not bad, and Marian liked it very much. A fresh start, perhaps, so she imagined her future fate when she was behind bars. But a couple of weeks later, a manager approached her at work when she was putting the goods on the shelves. "Marian, can I have a word with you?" "Yes, say it right here." "What are you talking about?" Marian asked, engrossed in her work. "Marian, it won't work here. It's important." They both went outside. The weather was fine, it was April, and it was even hot at times. "Marian, you see, today I was told from above. They say that you do not meet the qualification requirements here." The manager was very embarrassed. It was hard for her to inform this hard-working girl, who from the very first days of her work in this small grocery shop began to show enthusiasm and professionalism, that she was fired. "I see I don't fit in." Marian grinned. "Marian, what can I do?" "I was told to tell you." "Yeah, it's all about the criminal record. I know it's not your fault." Even though Marian was depressed that day, she knew there was no point in trying so hard to please the manager. She finished the day perfectly, without any complaints. "I'm sorry to see you go," her boss told her as she walked her out the next day. Marian just smiled sadly and walked to the bus stop with a cigarette. She smoked more and more often and worried about her future fate. It was an unpleasant day for Marian. She realized that she had no money to pay her rent and no success in finding a new job. She didn't want to be a beggar to her mother, but she decided to visit her family, at least to see her brother Jack and sister Cassandra. She stood for a long time in front of the windows of her home, hesitating to enter. It was her pride. In 3 years, her mother had never once bothered to find out about her. How could it be? Suddenly, her mind was full of different thoughts. What if something had happened to her? What if Marian, horrified at her own reasoning, went with a quick step into the flat? It was late in the evening. Everyone must be at home, and she rang the doorbell. It was Marian. She answered briefly to the sound of the inner door opening. A male, unfamiliar voice was heard in the distance. Another minute of fussing outside the door, and she was opened. "Marian, what are you doing here so early?" It was not a joke. It was a real misunderstanding on her mother's part, and Marian did not know whether to laugh or cry. In simple words, she was not welcome here. She walked to the living room. Her sister Cassandra was sitting there watching cartoons. Is it really her, Marian thought. The girl was all grown up, had grown-up features. Marian. Cassandra broke away from the TV series and ran up to her older sister. Marian couldn't contain her emotions. She took the girl in her arms, even though she was already overweight, and spun her around a little in front of her. "Cassandra, have you grown so big? You're 13, aren't you?" "Wow. I'm 13. And you're 20? Marian stared at her sister. Then her face turned from surprise to full of joyful emotion, and she laughed. "Cassandra, are you doing well in maths?" "How much?" Marian wondered. "I won't tell you." An unfamiliar man entered the room. He reluctantly said hello to his guest. Matthew. Matthew was tall and broad-shouldered and looked to be about 50 years old. Marian. "Nice to meet you. I'm your mother's husband." "I see," Marian replied quietly. Also, a lot had changed here, but not her mother's attitude towards her. "Mum, where's Jack?" Marian asked her mother at the table. They had all sat down to supper. "Jack lives alone now, not far from here. Would you like the address?" "Yes, of course." "Are you going to sleep over?" "No," said Marian modestly. "Come on. Where would you go at night? Do you have a place to stay or not?" Kimberly tried to be a bit of a caring mother, but she was not very good at it, and it didn't last long. The housemates persuaded Marian to stay the night and prepared a cot with clean linen. Before going to bed, Kimberly visited her daughter and they chatted about the detention. Marian talked about the future and the good lawyer, Mr. Christopher. And then her mother, for the umpteenth time in this life, upset her. "Marian," said gently and quietly to Kimberly, "I beg you very much, don't pretend to live here. Matthew and I are living so well. Jack has moved out. I'm finally happy. You understand me as a woman." "Mum," said Marian, "I'm not claiming anything." And that was the end of the conversation. They said goodnight to each other, and then Marian packed her things and left. Before leaving, her mother wanted to slip some note into her pocket. It was only 500, but Marian grinned sweetly, handed the money back and said, "Leave it. It's more important to you." She looked at Cassandra, who was as always staring at the television, even though the day was just beginning and she didn't even notice that Marian was leaving. The touching feeling she had for her was still there. She was a little sister, but Marian realized that everyone here would always be a stranger to her, and 13-year-old Cassandra was becoming more and more like her mother, losing her naive and childlike image. "Cassandra, at least go say goodbye to Marian." The girl reluctantly started and walked towards the corridor, all looking back at the TV screen. "Well, Cassandra, goodbye." Marian walked wherever she was going. She was only paying a month in advance, which meant that in a week or so she would have to move out due to not being able to pay for the room. She just wanted to wander around her hometown. Tears came to her at one point as she thought of her mother's words to her the night before. Marian hadn't been lying when she said she didn't need a place to live. She herself did not want to live in a flat with a strange man, and a man who would never be her family, who was only nominally so. Mother, who is this? Is it only worth giving birth to be called by that great sacred word? The last bright idea of family was disappearing in the girl's soul. She was at liberty, but she had neither work nor lodging, and there was absolutely nowhere to go. Stephen, the last time they had seen each other was a long time ago. It was early February, a whole 3 years ago. Back then, their relationship had come to a head and ended without announcement because Marian had gone to juvie. He was relatively young, good-looking, and successful. "I don't stand a chance," thought Marian as she sat in her room, listening to the occasional scandalous yelling coming from the next room. It was late in the evening. Without deciding anything, she went to bed. In the morning, having filtered all her thoughts and considerations overnight, Marian decided to go to Stephen's. She wasn't counting on anything, just financial help. He had helped her with her lawyer after all, and you could say, albeit indirectly, he had been involved in her parole. Perhaps he would give her some money for the first time, and that was fine with the ex-convict, who was practically at the bottom of her life. She wrote him a short message. "It's Varia. I'm free. You don't be afraid of me. I'm still the same. Tomorrow I'll be outside the shop at the Forest Cafe at 8. Marian was waiting for him at the table, drinking coffee. He was on time. He didn't have to wait a minute. From even farther away he smiled and pronounced, "Well, here we meet at last." Marian didn't hear anything, but smiled too and waved at him. "Yes, I see you, hello." The man hugged his acquaintance warmly and sat down opposite. "How are you?" asked Marian. "Yes, better than anyone else. I went even higher." "Wow, and what are you now?" "Yeah, I'm a regional manager. We don't just have New York locations anymore. We have Chicago, Florida, and Washington, D.C. now. So they're all over the place. Luckily, I was here yesterday and I'm here today. I'll be somewhere else tomorrow." "Wow." Marian was surprised. "You're doing great." "Just a little." Stephen smiled satisfactorily, full of pride. "I congratulate you on this event." "Thanks, but what about you?" "Got a place to live? Got a job?" "Well, it's hard right now. I couldn't even get a job at a grocery store." "I don't know, I'll keep looking." "And housing?" "I've been living in a flat for the last week." She sighed heavily and sadly. "What's wrong, Marian?" Stephen asked gently. "I don't want to be a beggar, but I'm in a bad situation." "Come on, Marian, we always help our own. I'll put 1,100 on your card for the first time. If you have any problems, just ask." Marian was glad that at least someone on this earth was not indifferent to her difficult situation. She had become accustomed to hardship, not wanting to live at the expense of others, and the money Stephen had given her she saw simply as salvation. No longer did she want to use it. Sitting in a cafe, she saw the ring on his finger and realized he was married. Stephen probably had children by now as well. He was a little different from his old self. He didn't have that lightness, and he spoke to her in a polite, decent way, leaving no hint at the end of the evening of any further development of the relationship. He was also a stranger to her, and yet she was grateful to him for another rescue. Standing on the balcony of her new accommodation, which she had paid for 2 months in advance, now feeling relatively stable, Marian smoked and enjoyed the cool late April day. She was determined. "I'll look for a job and I'll find one, but people. Who do I need? Self has me." She raised her head high, closed her eyes, and through the small slit of her thin lips, slowly the thick cigarette smoke seeped out. The summer came. Marian found a job. She was hired at a beauty parlor, cleaning the premises. She didn't just scrub the floors. The girl watched the work of masters who painted the visitors' nails, cut hair, corrected eyebrows, and applied eyelashes. In the future, Marian wanted to learn one of these professions. But to do this, it was necessary to earn money for the courses. When she had the first money, she immediately went to a needlework shop and bought a lot of beads. In the evenings, tired from scrubbing the parlor floors, Marian strung the little balls on thread, remembering her days in the colony. Strange thoughts crossed her mind. She missed those days, for in that life there were people like herself with whom she could have a heart-to-heart talk, and they wouldn't look at you as an outsider, no matter what you told them about your plight. One fine day, and it was fine, because it was a Saturday, Marian received a call from a stranger. Here we go, another divorce. Who else could it be, she thought sadly. Still, Marian answered the call. Hello, I'm listening. There was silence. Marian was about to press the red button, but then she heard a man's voice. Is this Marian? Yes, Marian, who is this? Marian, don't hang up right away. It's the man on the other end of the line was breathing heavily. He seemed to be having a hard time speaking. Tell me, who are you? Marian asked in bewilderment. I'm your dad. I have a lot to say, but don't hang up. I'm not hanging up. Calm down. Which dad is it, Marcus? No, this is your real daddy. My name is Sebastian. I was in contact with your mom, Kimberly, about 30 years ago. I'm asking you not to reject me right away. You're not living well. You need alimony. You'd better be honest with me, Marian replied resentfully, thinking that this man wanted only profit from her. We are like that, replied the man cheerfully. Well, I'm for honesty. No one needs me in this life, Papa, and I have no money. And I have no home. I have nothing and nobody. Yes, I know, but I have everything, but I have no one to share it with. You're the only one I've got. Well, will you come visit me in Florida? Where? Marian asked me. I live in Florida. I have my own business here. I know your mom a little bit. So I told her, like you, that I have nothing. I'm starving. I need help. She told me about you too. She said let her provide for you, but I knew you were my daughter. Anyway, it's not a phone conversation. I'll send you my address. Come and talk to me. Marian hung up the phone. She realized that everything in her life very soon and very abruptly changed. Not resenting fate, not expecting anything good from it, and yet not being angry at the world. Through suffering, pain, betrayals, and hardships, she finally waited for her bright streak.